Clouds drifted over the treetops, which were so enormous that their trunks looked like the walls of a high-rise building. He blinked. He blinked again. He raised his hand and saw the watch on his wrist. The screen was cracked. The time had stopped at 2:07 p.m. That was when the dump truck had entered the turn. He sat down. His head was buzzing. His ribs ached but weren't broken. He felt himself and found that the yellow courier jacket was still on him. His name tag hung from the lanyard. The insulated bag was pressing against his back. He mechanically unzipped it and looked inside. A cake. Strawberry. Order number 4471. The box was slightly dented on the side, but the cake itself stood upright. Jun Ho looked at the cake. He looked at the trees as tall as skyscrapers. He looked back at the cake. His brain did the only thing it knew how to do in an incomprehensible situation. He thought the customer would be unhappy about the delay. Something cracked to his right. He turned his head and saw a boy, naked from the waist up. His skin was dark from dirt and sun. In his hands was a stick with a charred end. The tip was pointing straight at Jun Ho. The boy was about 12 years old, maybe 13. His eyes were huge, and he looked at Jun Ho the way one looks at something incomprehensible, not with fear, but with calculation. He was trying to figure out if it was edible. Jun Ho raised his hands, palms forward. It was a universal gesture. In Seoul, he'd use it to signal he had no change. Here, it could mean anything. The boy didn't move. The spear didn't waver. Jun Ho licked his lips and uttered the phrase he'd said 40 times a day for 3 years straight. "Hello, here's your order." The boy blinked. He didn't understand a word, but the tone was so calm and so familiarly polite that the spear dropped 3 centimeters. That was enough. Jun Ho slowly got to his feet. His knees were shaking. The boy took a step back and raised the spear again. Somewhere to the left, in the thicket, something roared. The sound was low and heavy. It came from deep within the forest, and the ground beneath his feet vibrated with it. The boy flinched. His eyes darted toward the sound. The spear swung toward the thicket. He was no longer looking at Jun Ho. He was looking over there, and the way he was standing, the way his fingers had turned white on the spear shaft, the way he'd crouched slightly, ready to run. Jun Ho realized one simple thing. Whatever was roaring in the forest was far more terrifying than the strange man in the yellow jacket. The trees at the edge of the forest crackled. Something enormous was moving between the trunks. Jun Ho saw the silhouette, and his brain refused to process the information. A head the size of a passenger car. A jaw with teeth as long as his forearm. Small front paws. A tail that snapped branches as thick as an arm simply by moving. A T-Rex. A real one. Alive. 30 meters away from him. Jun Ho's brain finally short-circuited and rebooted, and his first thought after rebooting was this: delivery to this address will come with a surcharge. The boy grabbed his arm. His palm was small and rough as a piece of bark. He yanked Jun Ho back toward the rocks. Jun Ho ran. The bag with the cake banged against his back. Branches lashed his face. The boy dived into a crevice between 2 boulders and pulled him along. Jun Ho squeezed through after him. His jacket crackled. The badge snagged on a rock and flew off the lanyard. It fell to the ground outside. Jun Ho instinctively reached to pick it up. The boy slapped his hand away and hissed. The ground behind the crevice trembled. A huge paw sank into the mud a meter from the entrance. A shadow blocked the light. The T-Rex stopped right above them. Jun Ho pressed himself against the rock and held his breath. The boy next to him wasn't breathing either. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, maybe a minute, maybe 5. The beast tilted its head. A huge eye peered into the crevice. The pupil narrowed. Jun Ho could see every scale around that eye. He saw the scars on its snout. He saw its nostrils flare as it drew in air. The T-Rex could smell them. It knew they were there. but the crevice was too narrow. Its snout wouldn't fit through. The beast snorted. Hot air from its nostrils hit Jun Ho in the face. It smelled of blood and rotten meat. Then the T-Rex turned around. Its tail scraped against the rock with a screech, and it was gone. The ground stopped shaking. The boy next to Jun Ho exhaled. Jun Ho looked at him. The boy looked back at him. Between them lay the silence of two beings who had just nearly died together. Then Jun Ho opened his bag. He took out a box containing a cake. He lifted the lid. A strawberry cake with little pink cream roses sat perfectly upright. The boy stared at it. He had never seen anything like it in his life. Pink frosting, red berries. Something impossibly bright and impossibly beautiful in a world where colors were limited to gray stone and brown mud. Jun Ho broke off a piece and held it out to him. The boy sniffed it. He licked it. His eyes widened. He shoved the whole piece into his mouth and froze. Then he looked at Jun Ho with an expression that needed no translation. What is this? Where did this come from? Why had the world hidden from him that such a thing existed? Jun Ho allowed himself his first smile in this new world. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know when he was. He didn't know how to get back. But he knew one thing. The client was satisfied. They sat in the crevice until dark. The boy peeked out several times and listened. Then he waved his hand and crawled forward. Jun Ho followed him. Outside, the world looked even stranger than it had during the day. The moon was enormous. 2 moons. No, 1 moon and something else. A bright spot next to it. He didn't dwell on it. The boy led him along a path between the rocks. The path climbed upward. Dry pine needles crunched under their feet. It smelled of smoke, real, living smoke from a campfire. 10 minutes later, they came to a cave. The entrance was wide, about 5 meters. A fire was burning in front of it. People were sitting around the fire, about 20, maybe 25. Men and women, children, all wearing animal skins. The men had spears. One had a stone axe on a leather strap. They saw the boy and relaxed. Then they saw Jun Ho and tensed up again. Spears were raised. The stone axe was drawn. The boy began to speak, quickly, in a language of which Jun Ho could not make out a single word. He gestured, pointing at Jun Ho, pointing at the crevice from which they had come from. He pointed at his mouth and made chewing motions. The cake made an impression. The old man with the axe stepped closer. His face was like a piece of tanned leather. A scar ran from his left ear across his entire cheek to his chin. He looked at Jun Ho's yellow jacket, at his boots, at the bag. He reached out and touched the fabric of the jacket. He rubbed it between his fingers. His eyebrows crept upward. He had never seen such material before. Then he looked Jun Ho in the eyes, for a long time, intently, and said something briefly. The boy exhaled with relief. The spears were lowered. Jun Ho didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Stay alive, for now. He was shown a spot by the cave wall, far from the fire, far from the others, but not by the entrance where it was coldest. A spot in the middle, a place for someone whose status was still undecided. Not one of them, not an enemy, something in between. Jun Ho sat down on a cold rock and leaned against the wall. He took the remains of the cake out of his bag. The box was completely crushed. The frosting had smeared all over the sides, but half the cake was still intact. He closed the box and put it back. It was his only currency in a world where he knew not a single word, not a single rule, and not a single face. A shadow appeared beside him. A woman, not very tall, strong hands, dark eyes with an expression he'd seen on the faces of mothers in Seoul when they opened the door for the delivery person. Weariness and a slight irritation at the fact that the world was throwing something new at her again. She set a clay bowl in front of him. There was something in the bowl. Scraps, pieces of some kind of meat, liquid. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't hot, but it was food, and it was for him. The woman didn't say a word. She just set down the bowl and left. The little boy settled a few steps away from him and watched intently. Jun Ho picked up the bowl. He sniffed it. It smelled like a basement in August. He sighed. He ate every last bit. The little boy nodded approvingly. The woman by the fire glanced over and looked away. Something in her shoulders seemed to soften slightly. Jun Ho set the empty bowl down on a rock. He wiped his mouth with his jacket sleeve, and he thought. Delivery address unknown, customer name unknown, delivery time unknown, payment method missing, map of the area missing, vehicle lost, lost contact with the dispatcher, order status in progress. He closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. Somewhere beyond the cave walls, something roared, long and mournful. The sound rolled through the valley and died away. Then something else roared, closer. Then something else, even closer. The world outside the cave walls was full of things that didn't sleep at night and were hungry. Jun Ho didn't fall asleep until dawn. The morning began with movement. People were getting up before dawn. The women were stoking the embers, the men were sharpening their spears, the children were clearing yesterday's bones away from the entrance. Everything moved quickly and quietly. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Jun Ho sat by the wall and watched. His brain did what it did best. He counted. There were 23 people, 7 adult men, 9 women, 7 children of various ages. 3 of the men were hunters. Jun Ho could tell by the way they moved. Quiet, focused, their eyes constantly scanning the cave entrance. The other 4 were older. One limped. Another coughed so hard he was shaking all over. 4 of the women left at dawn, heading down the trail somewhere, and returned with armfuls of some kind of plants, gatherers. 3 others stayed with the children and tended the fires and the hides. 2 were very old. One of them sat against the far wall of the cave on a raised platform of stones covered with hides. In front of her stood 3 small skulls, lizards or birds. Small stones were arranged around the skulls in a pattern that clearly meant something. She didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the entrance. Her eyes lingered on Jun Ho, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Not a threat, something else. An assessment. She was sizing him up, figuring out who he was and what to do with him. It was Tari. He didn't know that yet. The boy appeared beside him like a shadow. He crouched down and pointed his finger at Jun Ho, then at himself. And he said the word, Teo. He pointed at himself again. Teo. Jun Ho understood. He pointed at the boy and repeated it. Teo. The boy broke into a smile. Then he pointed at Jun Ho and looked at him questioningly. Jun Ho pointed at himself. Jun Ho. The boy frowned. He tried to repeat it. It came out as something like Juno. Close. Good enough. Theo jumped up and dragged him toward the cave's exit. At the entrance, Jun Ho stopped. A view opened up before him that took his breath away. A valley, huge, green. The river below glistened in the morning light. Trees stood like a wall along both banks. Ferns as tall as a person covered the slopes. And moving among the ferns was a herd. Long-necked, gray-green, each one the size of a bus. They walked slowly and calmly. They stretched their necks upward and plucked leaves from the upper branches. Behind them came others, smaller ones, with bony crests on their heads. Dozens, maybe hundreds. A whole living stream moved through the valley, and the ground hummed beneath their footsteps. Theo stood nearby and looked at Jun Ho. He was waiting for a reaction. Apparently, seeing this sight every day still impressed even those who had lived here their whole lives. Jun Ho stood and watched. His mind ran through every possible explanation. Virtual reality, a coma, a hallucination. None of them fit. The dirt under his fingernails was real. The chill of the morning air was real. The smell of manure from the herd was very real. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know when he was. But he knew there were people here who were starving. There were herds here that provided meat. There was a distance between them. And if there was a distance, that meant there was a route. And if there was a route, that meant there was a delivery. He turned to Teo, pointed at the valley, pointed at the cave, traced a line with his hand from one to the other. Teo didn't understand, but Jun Ho didn't explain any further. He was thinking, and for the first time since he'd fallen into the mud, he felt a little better. The first 3 days were the hardest. Jun Ho couldn't speak. He couldn't explain who he was. He couldn't understand what was being said to him. Theo followed him around like a shadow and tried to teach him words. He'd point to a rock and say one word, point to water and say another, point to fire and say a third. Jun Ho repeated them, got them mixed up, repeated them again. By the end of the first day, he knew 10 words: rock, water, fire, meat, no, yes, walk, stand, dangerous, eat. By the end of the second day, he knew 20. By the end of the third, he could put together the simplest of phrases. Water there, no meat, fire is good. It wasn't much, but it was something. He watched how the tribe lived, and his courier's brain was working at full capacity. He saw problems. They were everywhere. The woman who brought him a bowl that morning, that very one, Nay, Theo's mother. Every morning she took 2 clay pots and went down to the stream. The stream was far away. The trail led steeply downhill. The rocks were wet and slippery. She carried the pots on her own, one in each hand, full, heavy. The climb back up took almost an hour. By evening, she had to make a second trip, every day, every single day. Her back wasn't bent from old age. She was 32, but she moved like a 60-year-old. Jun Ho saw this, and something inside him tightened. Not pity, professional irritation. This won't do. It's inefficient. 2 10-kilo pots over 1 kilometer with a 100-meter elevation gain twice a day. It's killing her, and she doesn't even know there's another way. On the third evening, Jun Ho approached Nay. She was sitting by the campfire, stretching her hands. Her fingers were red and swollen. He sat down next to her. She looked at him warily. He pointed at the pots. He pointed at his back. He shook his head. Not good. She frowned. He pointed at a stick leaning against the wall. He pointed at the pots. He gestured with his hands. She didn't understand. He didn't bother to explain further. In the morning, he asked Teo for a stick, a long one, a sturdy one. Theo brought it. Jun Ho asked the old man for a scrap of leather the old man used to tie up his lame leg. The old man looked at him for a long time, saying nothing. Then he took off the strap and handed it over. Jun Ho sat down away from the cave and began to work. He remembered what a yoke looked like, not from a textbook, from his grandfather's village near Daegu, where they used to take him in the summer when he was 7. His grandmother carried water on a yoke and explained to a grandson how to place it properly on his shoulders so it wouldn't chafe. He remembered how she balanced it, how the pots swayed in time with her steps, how the water hardly spilled at all. He muttered to himself in Korean as he worked. Teo sat nearby and watched. Several times he slipped him pieces of vine for the straps. Jun Ho didn't ask. Teo could see for himself what was needed. A smart kid. By noon, the yoke was ready. Crooked, rough. One end was thicker than the other, but it worked. Then he took 2 long sticks and tied them together with crossbars. He stretched a piece of hide between them. It turned out to be a sled. Primitive, but it worked too. The old man's belt became a strap that could be slung over the shoulder. He waited for Nay by the trail leading to the stream. She came out with the pots as usual. She saw him, she saw the yoke, she saw the sled. She stopped. He demonstrated. He placed the yoke on his shoulders. He hung the pots from it. He took a few steps. The pots swayed but stayed in place. The weight was distributed across his shoulders rather than his arms. Nay watched. Then he pointed to the sled. He placed the pots on it. He slung the strap over his shoulder. He pulled. The sled rolled down the path. Stones scraped against the hide, but the pots stayed in place. Nay approached. She grabbed the strap. She pulled. The sled moved. Nay took a step, another, a third. The pots were full. She pulled them behind her, her back straight. She stopped. She looked at her hands. She looked at the cart. She looked at Jun Ho. And she began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears simply streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. 10 years. For 10 years, her back had been breaking under the weight of those pots.
For 10 years, she'd fallen asleep with pain between her shoulder blades and woken up with it. And now, a strange man in a yellow jacket had, in a single day, made sure the pain would be gone. Teo stood behind Jun Ho and was also looking at his mother. His face was serious. He realized something at that moment, something about this stranger that was more important than the cake and more important than being saved from a T-Rex. On the 4th day, Jun Ho woke up to Theo shaking his shoulder. It was still dark. The boy gestured that he needed to come with him. Jun Ho got up. His body ached. Sleeping on a rock without a mattress was worse than he'd thought. Back in Seoul, he'd complained about his 200,000 won mattress. Now he'd pay $1 million for that mattress. Teo led him to the exit. 3 hunters were already standing at the entrance. A young guy with 2 spears, a broad-shouldered man with a stone knife at his belt, and one more, skinny, wiry. His eyes were quick and cold. He looked at Jun Ho the way one looks at an obstacle, not an enemy, but something superfluous that would get in the way. Jun Ho remembered that look. 3 years as a courier had taught him to distinguish the nuances of hostility. Theo pointed at the hunters and the forest, then at Jun Ho. He wanted to take him hunting. No, not hunting, foraging. Teo pointed at the ground, at the plants, gathering, women's work. But the boy wasn't shy about it. He gathered and hunted. He did everything. A skinny hunter snorted and said something sharp. Teo replied curtly. The hunter turned away. Jun Ho understood the meaning without a translation. Why drag along a useless one? They descended into the valley. Jun Ho walked last. His boots slipped on the wet rocks. Courier boots, lightweight, with thin soles. Made for asphalt, not for the jungle. He slipped 3 times in the first 200 meters. The skinny hunter turned around and looked at him every time. His name was Kesso. Jun Ho learned that later. For now, he was simply the one who looks on with contempt. The forest below was another world. The trees closed in overhead and no light reached the ground. It smelled of rotting leaves and something sweet. The ferns reached up to his waist. It squelched under his feet. Teo walked with confidence. He knew every rock, every root, every tree. From time to time, he would stop and point something out to Jun Ho. You can eat these berries. They're red, small, sour enough to make your jaw clench, but edible. You can't eat these ones, he said. They look similar, but they have a white dot on the skin. Jun Ho took note. Red ones without a dot, yes. With a dot, no. You can dig up this root and chew on it, he said. It's bitter but filling. This one looks similar, but it'll make your stomach swell up and you could die. The difference is in the shape of the leaf. The edible one has 3 teeth. The poisonous one has 4. Jun Ho looked and counted. 3 serrations, 4 serrations. Red ones without a dot. With a dot, death. The world was full of tiny details on which life depended. Like addresses in Gangnam. House 47 and House 47-1 stand next to each other, but one of them has no elevator, and on the 9th floor lives a woman who gives tips, while the other is an office where the security guard won't let anyone past the 1st floor. Details decide everything. Here too. Theo stopped by a tree with a thick trunk and dark bark. He pointed upward. Fruit hung from the branches, round, greenish-yellow, the size of a fist. Theo climbed up.
He climbed like a monkey, quickly and effortlessly, clinging to the bark with his toes. Within a minute, he was on the lowest branch. He began plucking the fruits and tossing them down. Jun Ho caught them. 1, 2, 6, 10. He put them in a thermal bag from which he'd shaken out the last crumbs of cake the day before. The bag was perfect for this. Insulated, sturdy. It held 15 kilograms. He stuffed it full of fruit. Teo climbed down. He picked up a piece of fruit and bit into it. Juice ran down his chin. He held out half to Jun Ho. Jun Ho tasted it. The flavor was strange, something between a pear and a raw potato. Not tasty, but not disgusting either. Filling. He finished it and wiped his hands on his jacket. The yellow jacket wasn't yellow anymore. Dirt, juice, and sweat had turned it into something brown and stained. But the delivery service logo on the back was still legible. A little man on a scooter, racing forward. Theo would sometimes touch that logo and ask something. Jun Ho couldn't explain it, not yet anyway. The hunters had gone ahead. Theo and Jun Ho stayed in the staging area. Jun Ho worked and observed. His brain was mapping out the terrain, the trail from the cave to the stream, about 1 kilometer, 100-meter elevation gain. The trail from the cave to the assembly area, 1.5 kilometers, almost flat. The trail from the assembly area to the river, another 2 kilometers to the east. He memorized the landmarks. A tree with a split trunk, a rock that looked to a head, the spot where the trail splits. The left path goes down to the water, the right one leads somewhere further on. Theo indicated that they shouldn't take the right path, it's dangerous. Jun Ho didn't ask why. He saw the tracks on the ground, 3 toes. Each print was the size of his palm. The claw marks were deep and fresh. Something large had been here recently, a raptor, maybe several. Theo walked around the tracks in a wide arc, and Jun Ho did the same. By noon, they were back. The bag was full. Theo was dragging an armful of roots tied together with vines. Jun Ho dumped the fruit at the cave entrance. Nay came over and looked. There was more fruit than usual. The courier's bag held 3 times as much as the leather pouch the women used. Nay picked up a piece of fruit. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at the bag. She looked at Jun Ho. He could see her thinking. A new thing. A useful thing. She put the fruit back and walked away, but he noticed that she glanced back at the bag one more time. That evening, Jun Ho sat by the campfire and thought. He was counting their supplies. 23 people. There was enough food for 1 day, maybe 2 if the hunters brought back a catch. And if they didn't, then by the evening of the 2nd, someone would go to bed hungry. The children first. No, the children last. Here it was the other way around. The children were fed first, then the hunters, then the rest. It made sense. Children are the future, hunters are the present, the rest are what lies in between. But there were no reserves, none at all. Not a single piece of meat for tomorrow, not a single root saved for later. Every day started from scratch. Every day was a battle for survival that was reset at dawn. It was wrong. It was so wrong that Jun Ho's hands itched. He remembered the restaurants in Seoul, not fancy ones, just ordinary ones, small basement eateries where ajumas made kimchi in vats the size of bathtubs, kimchi that sat for months and only got better. He remembered how one chef had explained it to him while packing up an order. Fermentation, bacteria, salt, time. You take cabbage that would rot in 3 days, you salt it, you add garlic and pepper, you seal it, you wait. And a week later, you have food that won't spoil for half a year. Magic. No, not magic. Chemistry. As simple as a stick with a burnt end. He needed salt. He turned to Teo. He pointed to the meat lying by the fire. He demonstrated sprinkling something on it. Teo didn't understand. Jun Ho licked his finger and mimed tasting it. He grimaced. He indicated a sharp sensation on his tongue. Teo thought for a moment, then his face cleared. He said a word, a short one. Then he pointed south, far away. Jun Ho understood. There was salt, but it was far away. He held up 3 fingers and pointed at the sun, a 3-day journey. Theo shook his head. He held up 5 fingers. 5 days. That's far, dangerous. No one goes there. Jun Ho nodded and set the thought aside, but he didn't dismiss it. On the 5th day, something happened that changed his status in the tribe. The hunters left at dawn and hadn't returned by noon. They hadn't returned by evening. Borak stood at the entrance, looking down at the trail. His face was impassive, but his hands were clenched around an axe. The women were silent. The children sat quietly. Everyone knew what this meant. The hunters had ventured into raptor territory. Sometimes they were delayed. Sometimes they didn't return at all. The night passed in silence. No one slept. Nay sat next to Theo and held his shoulder. The boy wanted to go look for them. She wouldn't let him. Jun Ho sat by the wall, lost in thought. What if the hunters didn't return? 3 hunters out of 7 men. That's nearly half the tribe's hunters gone. The tribe wouldn't survive. The math was simple and brutal. At dawn on the 6th day, the hunters returned, 2 of them, a broad-shouldered man and Kason. The young man with the 2 spears hadn't returned. The broad-shouldered man carried a carcass on his back, something medium-sized, like a large turkey, but with teeth. Kason walked empty-handed. His left arm hung limply at his side. His shoulder was torn open. Blood had crusted black from his shoulder to his elbow. 3 gashes from claws. A raptor. Kason reached the cave and sat down against the wall. He didn't make a sound. Tari got up from her perch and walked over to him. She looked at the wound. She took some leaves out of a leather pouch. She chewed them and packed the resulting paste into the wound. Kason flinched. He clenched his teeth. Tari wrapped a strip of hide around his shoulder and went back to her spot. Jun Ho looked at the wound. It was dirty. The leaves might have helped, or they might not have. Infection in this world killed faster than predators.
He walked over to the fire. He scooped up some water in a clay pot. He set it on the coals. He waited for it to boil. He knew nothing about medicine, but he knew one thing. Boiled water is cleaner than raw water. Every Korean knew that from childhood. When the water came to a boil, he removed the pot. He waited for it to cool to a tolerable temperature. He walked over to Kason. The hunter looked up at him. His gaze was heavy. Jun Ho pointed at the wound. He pointed at the water. He indicated that he wanted to rinse it. Kason didn't move. Jun Ho carefully removed the hide bandage. He removed the leaves. The wound was jagged and deep, 3 parallel gashes. The edges were inflamed. Inside were dirt and dried blood. He slowly poured warm, boiled water over the wound. Kason hissed through clenched teeth. Jun Ho rinsed it carefully. The water ran off brown. He rinsed it 3 times. Then he put the leaves back in place. He tied it off with the clean strip of fabric he'd torn from the lining of his jacket. The fabric was synthetic, smooth. It didn't catch on the wound like leather would. Kason looked at the bandage. He wiggled his hand. The fabric held. It didn't pinch. It didn't rub. He looked at Jun Ho. For the first time in 5 days, there was no contempt in his gaze, nor was there gratitude. Something in between, confusion. This useless outsider had just done something useful. Kason didn't know how to classify it, and he didn't like it. Tari was watching too. She had seen everything. She saw the outsider boiling water, even though no one in the tribe boils water for wounds. She saw him rinsing the wound instead of bandaging it. She saw the fabric of his clothes. She didn't know what synthetic material was, but she knew that this fabric was unlike anything from their world. Her eyes narrowed. She turned toward the skulls and pebbles in front of her and sat motionless for a long time. Jun Ho couldn't see her face, but if he could, he would have seen fear, not toward him, toward what he was bringing, toward the changes to come.
Tari had lived her entire life in a world where she knew the answers to every question. The spirits spoke through her. She interpreted dreams, she healed with herbs, she decided who was right and who was wrong. And now a man had come who didn't consult the spirits, who boiled water, who made strange things out of sticks and leather. And people were looking at him. They were starting to look at him instead of her.
On the 7th day, Jun Ho began to build. He found a flat spot near the cave, rocky, sheltered from the wind by a cliff. He asked Teo for help. The boy brought 2 more teenagers. They hauled stones. Jun Ho stacked them. He was building a smokehouse. Nothing complicated, the simplest kind. A pit in the ground, stone walls, a flat stone on top with a slit for smoke. He'd seen ones like this in documentaries. He'd seen a cook at a diner in Itaewon smoke a duck in an iron cabinet and explain that the principle was the same everywhere. Smoke, heat, time. The meat absorbs the flavor and doesn't rot. A week, 2, a month if they're lucky. He worked on it for 2 days. Theo helped in silence. At first, the teenagers didn't understand what they were doing. Then one of them figured it out and his eyes lit up. He ran over to Nay and started explaining. May came over and looked. She didn't understand. No one understood until Jun Ho placed a few pieces of meat inside. He lit a fire underneath. He covered it with a rock. Smoke began to rise. The meat started to sizzle. The smell spread throughout the clearing in front of the cave. Borak came out and stood silently, watching the smoke. 6 hours later, Jun Ho opened the smoker. The meat was dark, dry, tough. He cut off a piece with a stone knife he'd borrowed from Teo and tasted it. Tough, too salty, under-smoked on one side, far from ideal, but edible. And it wouldn't go bad by tomorrow. He held out a piece to Borak. The chief took it, sniffed it, took a bite, chewed for a long time. Then he swallowed and said one word. Jun Ho didn't know it, but Theo translated with a gesture. More. By the end of the 2nd week, Jun Ho knew 40 words and could speak like a 2-year-old. The meat is ready. The water is hot. Theo, help. The trail is dangerous. That was enough for work, but not enough for what was brewing. And a lot was brewing. The smokehouse was in operation. Meat hung there every day. After 2 days of smoking, it became tough and dark and could sit for a week without spoiling. For the first time in the tribe's history, they had a stockpile, a small one, 3 or 4 pieces for a rainy day. But it was there, and that fact changed everything. The women stopped going out to forage every day. Now they went every other day. In the time they saved, they tanned hides and wove ropes from vines. The children became calmer. They no longer woke up in the middle of the night from hunger. Borak began to sleep a little longer in the mornings. Not by much, just half an hour. But for a man who had woken up before dawn for 20 years, constantly fearing for his tribe, those half an hour felt like a vacation. Kassan was recovering. The wound was healing cleanly. A synthetic fabric bandage kept dirt from getting inside. Jun Ho changed it every day. He rinsed it with boiled water. Each time, Kassan sat silently and looked away. He didn't say thank you. He didn't speak. But he had stopped looking at him with contempt. Now he looked at him with something resembling irritation. Jun Ho knew that look. It was the same look restaurant owners in Seoul gave him when he arrived on time and they had no grounds to complain. It's unpleasant to admit that someone is doing their job well when you want to dislike them. The problem started with Tari. On the 15th day, she stepped out into the middle of the cave at dawn and began to speak, at length, loudly. Her voice echoed off the walls, giving it a resonance that sent shivers down his spine. Jun Ho didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was warning them. She was scaring them. Teo sat next to him, his face tense. Jun Ho touched his shoulder and looked at him questioningly. Teo spoke slowly, choosing simple words. Tari says the spirits are evil. The stranger is disrupting the order. The smoke rising from the stones is the breath of the dead.
Food that doesn't rot is a curse. If we don't drive the stranger away, the spirits will take the hunters." Jun Ho listened and his heart sank. He understood what was happening. Tari wasn't angry, she was frightened. For 20 years, she had been explaining the world to these people. A child is sick, the spirits punish. A hunter didn't return, the spirits took him. Winter came, the spirits sleep. Her system worked, not because it was right, but because there was no other way. And then he came, and his system worked too. The meat didn't rot, the water was clean, Nay's back didn't hurt, and people saw that his explanations were simpler. Do this, and that will happen. No spirits, no sacrifices, no fear. Tari wasn't losing her power, she was losing her purpose. If the world can be explained without spirits, then what's the point of a shaman? Borak listened to Tari and remained silent. He didn't take her side, but he didn't take Jun Ho's side either. The chief thought, a shaman is needed. She heals, she comforts, she explains death. But a stranger is needed too. He feeds people, he fixes things.
He does things that no one else knows how to do. Borak stood between them and didn't move. Jun Ho knew this type, a middle manager. Doesn't want conflict. He wants everyone to work and no one to complain. The problem was that in this world, compromise meant something specific. Tari could demand a trial. Teo had explained it to him that evening. In their tradition, if a shamanist declares someone cursed, that person must prove otherwise. A test of the spirits. Usually, this meant going into the forest for 3 days without weapons and returning alive. If you returned, it meant the spirits had accepted you. If you didn't return, it meant the spirits had taken you. Simple logic. For someone who hadn't ventured into a forest with tyrannosaurs. Jun Ho didn't wait. On the morning of the 16th day, he got up before everyone else. He took the smoker. He gathered some coals. He went out to the clearing in front of the cave, and he began to cook. He took the supply of meat from the smoker. He chopped it into small pieces with a stone knife. He found a flat stone. He heated it over the coals. He laid the meat on the stone. It sizzled. The aroma wafted through the morning air and drifted into the cave. People began to wake up and come out. Jun Ho added the roots he'd gathered with Teo to the meat. He sliced them thinly. He placed them nearby. He remembered that Nay had a clay pot with some kind of liquid, sour, like fermented berry juice. He asked her for some. Nay gave it to him. He poured the liquid over the meat on the stone. Steam rose. The aroma changed. It became sharper, more intriguing. The acidity began to tenderize the meat. 10 minutes later, he removed the meat from the stone. He laid it out on a large sheet. He placed the hot roots next to it. It made 12 servings, small ones, but hot, and smelling so good that several children came over and stood silently, staring at the food with an expression that Jun Ho recognized from the faces of customers waiting for delivery. Impatience. Hungry impatience. He began to hand them out. He gave the first one to Borak. The chief took it and tasted it. His eyebrows twitched. The meat was different. Not raw, not just smoked. It had been prepared. It had flavor, a hint of tartness from the berry juice and a crunch from the stems. Borak swallowed and gave Jun Ho a long look. Then Jun Ho gave some to the children, then to the women, then to the hunters.
Kesson took his portion with his good hand and ate in silence. His expression didn't change, but he ate slowly. He didn't gulp it down in big bites as usual. He ate slowly. Jun Ho placed the last portion on a rock in front of the entrance to the part of the cave where Tari was sitting. He didn't carry it to her. He didn't hand it to her. He simply set it down and walked away. Tari looked at the piece of meat with the tendons still attached. It was hot, fragrant. She didn't touch it in front of everyone, but when Jun Ho turned around an hour later, the meat was gone. He hadn't won an argument. He'd bought time. Tari hadn't backed down, but she fell silent. For a day, for 2. She observed, she counted, she calculated. Jun Ho used this pause. He needed a project that would show everyone he wasn't a threat, something big, something visible, something that would help the whole tribe, not just one person. And he knew what it would be. A bicycle. No, not a bicycle. A bicycle was a long way off. A wheel, just a wheel. He thought about it every night as he fell asleep on the rock. A wheel, an axle, a bearing. No, the bearing later. First, just a round thing that rolls. 2 semesters of engineering. He remembered a lecture on the history of mechanics. The first wheel in human history wasn't for transportation, it was for a potter's wheel. Then someone figured out to lay it on its side and mount it on an axle, and the world changed forever. But he didn't need a potter's wheel. He needed a cart, the simplest kind. 2 axles, 4 wheels, a platform on top, pull it and haul it, instead of carrying it on his back. The problem was the wheels, what to make them of. Stone is too heavy and brittle, clay would crumble. Wood would work. A log, round, thick, heavy but sturdy. He needed a log of the right diameter and a stone axe to cut it off. He went to Borak. It was hard to explain, 40 words and gestures. He drew in the sand, a circle, a stick across the circle, another circle, a platform on top. Borak looked at the drawing and didn't understand. Jun Ho picked up a small pebble, round. He placed it on a flat surface. He pushed it. The pebble rolled away. Borak followed it with his eyes. Jun Ho pointed to the drawing and then to the pebble. Borak looked again, and Jun Ho saw the moment when understanding lit up in the chief's eyes, slowly, like embers being fanned. Borak pointed to the drawing and the path from the cave to the stream. Jun Ho nodded.
Borak pointed to the pots of water that Nay had been hauling on his sled. Jun Ho nodded again. Borak slapped him on the shoulder. It hurt. The chief's palm was like a slab of stone, but it was a sign of agreement. For the next 10 days, Jun Ho worked like a dog. Teo was by his side the whole time. The boy learned faster than anyone else Jun Ho had ever met. He watched Jun Ho draw on the sand and memorized the motions. He began drawing himself, diagrams, lines, and curved but recognizable copies of what Jun Ho was doing. Borak assigned one of the senior hunters with an axe to work with them. They found a tree of the right diameter, about 20 centimeters. They spent half a day chopping it down. The trunk fell, and Jun Ho began cutting. He needed planks, 4 of them, each 10 centimeters thick. The stone axe didn't saw, it chopped and splintered. The first 2 planks fell apart, the third cracked, the fourth turned out crooked but intact. The 5th was better, the 6th was even better. By the end of the 2nd day, he had 4 acceptable wheels, crooked, different sizes, but round, more or less. The axle was easier, a straight stick, sturdy, dry. He drilled a hole in the center of each wheel. He drilled with a sharpened stone. He turned it clockwise. His palms were rubbed raw. Theo took over when Jun Ho couldn't. The holes turned out uneven, the axle went in crooked, the wheel wobbled. He wrapped strips of leather around the joint. It got a little better, not good, but a little better. He made the platform out of 2 long sticks tied together with crossbars. On top, he laid a mat woven from twigs. It turned out to be a cart. It was ugly, crooked. One wheel was bigger than the other, and the cart veered to the left as it moved. But it rolled. He placed a stone weighing 20 kilograms on it. He gave it a push. The cart rolled a meter, 2, 3. The wheel came off. He put it back on. He pushed again. 5 meters. The wheel creaked so loudly that something in the woods growled in response. But the cart kept moving. He rolled it out onto the clearing in front of the cave. The tribe stood and watched. 23 pairs of eyes. The children clung to their mothers. One of the hunters held his spear at the ready. A strange contraption. It moves on its own. It might be dangerous. Jun Ho placed 2 pots of water on the cart, full ones. He rolled it down the trail. The pots swayed but stayed in place.
The cart creaked and bounced over the rocks. One wheel nearly came off again. He rolled 50 meters and stopped. He turned around.
Theo stood with his mouth. Nay pressed her hand to her lips. Borak wasn't looking at the cart. He was looking at the path, the level path that led to the stream. He was thinking, if this thing can carry 2 pots, it can carry meat, hides, stones for a fire, everything they carry on their backs. His eyes lit up with the same fire as when he had understood the pattern in the sand. Tari stood at the entrance to the cave and didn't move. Her face was expressionless, but her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. On the 20th day, it rained. Not the kind of rain Jun Ho knew in Seoul, not the gray drizzle he'd ride his scooter through, his phone wrapped in a plastic bag. Here, the rain was a wall. Water fell from the sky in a continuous torrent, turning the trails into rivers and the clearing in front of the cave into a lake. The rain pounded so hard that the rocks vibrated. Flashes of lightning revealed the silhouettes of trees in the darkness, and Jun Ho flinched every time because one of the silhouettes was moving. Something large was standing in the forest, waiting out the rain. The tribe sat inside the cave, motionless. The hunters didn't go out, the gatherers didn't go out. The campfires smoldered because the damp air forced the smoke back down. The children were coughing. One of the elders lay on the animal skins and wouldn't get up. His cough was wet and labored. Tari sat over him, chewing on leaves. Jun Ho looked at the old man and thought that if this were Seoul, an ambulance would have arrived in 8 minutes. There was no ambulance here. Here there was only smoke and leaves and the hope that the body would pull through on its own. It had been raining for 3 days. On the 2nd day, their supply of smoked meat ran out. There hadn't been much to begin with, just 3 or 4 pieces for 23 people. Jun Ho berated himself. He knew they should have prepared more. They should have smoked meat every day, not just when the hunters brought back extra. He should have stuffed the smoker to the brim at the first opportunity. But he didn't get around to it. He'd been busy with the cart. He'd wasted time on the wheels when he should have been spending it on food. A mistake in priorities. In Seoul, he would have gotten a fine from the dispatcher and a warning from the manager for something like this. Here, they paid for it with hunger. By the evening of the 2nd day, the children began to cry. Quietly, not out of whim. Out of empty stomachs. Nay handed out the last few scraps. They were enough for half a serving each. Borak sat at the entrance and watched the rain. His face was stony. He was making a decision. On the morning of the 3rd day, he stood up and took his spear. Kesson stood behind him. His hand hadn't fully healed yet, but he held the spear in his right hand. The broad-shouldered hunter stood in 3rd place. They were about to head out into the rain, into the forest, where something large stood among the trees, waiting. Jun Ho stood up as well. Everyone looked at him. He pointed to himself and to the cart standing by the cave wall. He pointed to the trail leading to the gathering area. Even in the rain, there might be fruit on the trees. Even in the rain, the roots didn't disappear from the ground. He didn't need to hunt. He needed to gather. Borak looked at him. He looked at the cart. He nodded. The 4 of them set out. The hunters headed down toward the river. Jun Ho headed for the gathering area. The rain pelted his face so hard that he couldn't see more than 10 steps ahead. His boots sank into the mud within the first 100 meters. He took them off and walked barefoot. The rocks cut into his feet. Mud got wedged between his toes. He dragged the cart behind him. It got stuck every 3 meters. The wheels sank into the mud. He pulled it out. He pushed it. It got stuck again. It was agonizing, but he kept going, because in the cave the children were crying from hunger, and that was reason enough. He reached the fruit-bearing tree an hour later. The trip usually took 20 minutes. The tree stood there, wet and black. The fruit hung from its branches. He climbed up. His hands slipped on the wet bark. He lost his grip twice. He scraped his palms. A splinter went so deep into his finger that he cried out, but he kept climbing, and he picked the fruit, and he threw it down.
Theo appeared out of the rain like a ghost. The boy was following him. Of course he was following him. Theo began gathering the fruit into the cart. They worked in silence. The rain roared all around them. Thunder rumbled across the sky. Lightning flashed. In one of the flashes, Jun Ho saw movement, below, under the trees. 3 silhouettes, fast, crouching low. They moved in jerks, stopped, sniffed the air, moved on. Raptors, 3 of them, a pack. They were walking along the trail, his trail. He froze on a branch. Theo froze too. The boy had seen them before.
He was already standing motionless behind a tree trunk. His hand gripped the spear.
But a spear against 3 raptors is no weapon. It's a toothpick. The raptors walked past. Their claws clacked against the wet rocks. One of them stopped by the cart, sniffed, nudged it with its nose. The cart tipped over. The fruit rolled out into the mud. The raptor snorted and moved on. It wasn't interested. They were looking for meat, not fruit. Jun Ho and Theo waited in the tree for another 20 minutes after the raptors had disappeared. Then they climbed down. They gathered the fruit. They turned the cart right side up, and they headed back, quickly, as fast as the mud would let them. They returned to the cave, wet and shivering. The cart was full, 30 fruits, maybe more, enough for a day and a half if they stretched it out. Nay met them at the entrance. She looked at the fruits, she looked at Theo, she looked at Jun Ho. His legs were covered in blood from the rocks. His hands were scratched. The splinter was sticking out of his finger. He stood in the rain with the full cart, breathing heavily. Nay took the fruit and began handing it out. Then she returned to Jun Ho. She took his hand, pulled out the splinter, washed his hands with warm water from a pot, wrapped his palms in a soft strip of hide. All in silence, all quickly. Then she motioned for him to sit by the fire, not by the wall where he usually slept, by the fire where it was warm, where his own people slept. Jun Ho sat down. Theo sat next to him. Nay brought them food, roots with berries, hot water. They ate and dried off by the fire. And Jun Ho thought that this was the first time he'd been seated by the fire instead of against the wall. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. The sun beat down on the wet world and everything sparkled. Jun Ho stepped out of the cave and saw the valley after the rain. The river below had swollen. A herd of long-necked creatures had moved up to higher ground. The ferns glistened with raindrops, and the air, clean and heavy with moisture and the scent of greenery. He stood there, breathing. Theo stood beside him, breathing as well. Borak returned with the hunters on the 5th day. They brought back their catch, a large one, something resembling a young triceratops, but without horns. The meat lasted 3 days. Jun Ho packed the smokehouse to the brim. Every piece they didn't eat right away, he hung up to smoke. No more mistakes with supplies. Never again.
After the rain, Jun Ho made a decision. He needed salt. Without salt, he couldn't ferment food. Without fermentation, he couldn't preserve food for months. Without long-term storage, the tribe remained trapped in a cycle of day-to-day survival. One rain and hunger returned. One unsuccessful day of hunting, and the children's eyes would be empty again. He approached Borak. He drew in the sand. He showed the route. A cave, a trail, south. 5 days, salt. Borak looked at the drawing. His face grew serious. 5 days one way, 10 days round trip, through territories none of the tribe knew, through forests teeming with predators. The chief shook his head. No, too dangerous, too far. We can't afford to lose people. Jun Ho insisted. He pointed to the smokehouse, to the meat, to the children. He explained that without salt, the meat would spoil in a week anyway, that smoking was only a stopgap measure, that he needed salt to build up a real supply. Borak listened. He thought it over, and refused again. Cassin came over that same evening. His hand was healing. The bandage was still on, but the wound had closed. He sat down across from Jun Ho and spoke to him for the first time.
slowly, in simple words, as if to a child. "You want to go south." Jun Ho nodded. Casson paused. Then he said, "It's bad out there." "There are flocks there, big flocks, not 3, 20, 30, entire territories swarming with raptors. No one goes there." Jun Ho listened. He understood every third word, but the general meaning was clear. The South meant death. But there was salt in the South, and without salt, the tribe wouldn't survive the winter. Kesson looked at him. Then he said something Jun Ho didn't understand. Theo, sitting next to him, translated with gestures. Kesson said, "You can't run, you can't fight, you can't climb. You'll die on the first day." Jun Ho knew that Kesson was right. He was a scooter courier, not a survivalist. His feet were rubbed raw and bleeding from a single trip to gather fruit. His hands were scratched from a single climb up a tree. In a head-on clash with a raptor, he was food, not an opponent, food. But he also knew that without salt, everything he'd built was temporary. A smokehouse without salt is a half measure. Unfermented supplies last a week, not a month. He needed salt as much as he needed air. The solution came 3 days later. Jun Ho had been thinking about it constantly. On his route in Seoul, he never walked. He rode, on a scooter.
The scooter allowed him to cover distances that would take hours on foot. He didn't have a scooter, but he had a cart, and there was an idea that had been nagging at him since day one. A bicycle. Not the kind of bicycle he knew, not a carbon fiber frame and rubber tires. A wooden one, rough, like the first bicycles in history. A hand car. 2 wheels, a frame, a seat, no pedals, no chain. You just sit there and push off the ground with your feet. It was simpler than the cart. 2 wheels instead of 4, 1 axle, 1 frame. He could build it in a week, maybe 2. And then the journey to the salt would be cut in half. 5 days would become 3, or maybe 2. He began building the next day. The frame came first, 2 long sticks, joined at the top and spread apart at the bottom. Between them, a crossbar for the seat. On the crossbar, he placed a piece of hide stuffed with dry moss, the seat. He made the wheels better than those on the cart. He selected the wood more carefully. He cut it more. 2 cuts of the same size, almost the same. The axle was made from a hard, straight tree trunk. He wrapped the joints with hide and vines. Everything creaked, everything wobbled, but it held together. On the 3rd day of construction, Theo brought a little girl over to him, a small one, about 7 years old. She stood there watching what he was doing. Then she came over and held out a stone to him, round, smooth, polished by the river, the size of his palm, perfectly shaped. Jun Ho took the stone. He looked at it. He looked at the girl. She pointed to the cart's axle, to the spot where the wheel was rubbing against the frame. She was suggesting he place the stone between them to reduce the friction. She was 7 years old, and she had just invented a primitive bearing. Jun Ho looked at Theo. The boy shrugged. "That's my sister. She's always like that." The handcar was ready, but the road wasn't. Jun Ho realized this on the 2nd day of training. The trail from the cave to the stream was fine for walking and for dragging the handcar. For wheels, it was a disaster. Rocks, roots, uneven ground, pits filled with water. The wheels got stuck every 5 meters. One of them cracked after 3 hours. Jun Ho repaired it, replaced it, wrapped it in leather, but the problem wasn't the wheels. The problem was the trail. He needed a road, not asphalt, not concrete, just a level strip of earth cleared of rocks and roots, tamped down, straight, wide enough for a cart and a handcar. He had never built roads, but he had traveled on them for 3 years and knew what they should be like. Smooth, predictable, without surprises. Every pothole on the road is lost time. Every rock is a risk of breaking a wheel. Every blind turn is a potential encounter with something that eats people. He went to Borak. He explained. He drew in the sand. A line from the cave to the stream. Straight, smooth, cleared. He showed a cart on that line. Fast, easy. Borak understood right away. The problem lay elsewhere. Clearing the trail meant work, a lot of it, for a long time, by people who were already busy just trying to survive. Every hour spent on the road was an hour not spent hunting or gathering. Borak thought about it for 2 days. Then he went to Jun Ho and said one word. Theo translated. Who? Who would do the work? Jun Ho was prepared for this question. He pointed to the women, not the foragers, the ones who stayed in the cave, 3 women and 2 old men. They tanned hides and wove ropes, work that didn't take a full day. They had free time, an hour or 2 a day. If each of them spent an hour clearing the trail, it would be ready in 10 days. Borak did the math. He looked at Jun Ho, he looked at the trail, and he nodded. Work began the next morning. Jun Ho mapped out the route. He walked from the cave to the stream and back 3 times. He memorized every rock, every root, every turn. Then he drew the route on a flat rock with charcoal, a straight line with 2 gentle turns. Not along the old trail, along the new route, slightly longer but smoother. He went around large rocks instead of clearing them away. He went around trees with massive roots. He chose sections with soft soil that was easier to pack down. 3 women and 2 old men came out with sticks and stone scrapers. Teo came without being asked. Kason came without being asked. This surprised Jun Ho more than anything else. Kesson didn't say a word. He simply picked up a stone axe and began chopping at the roots that crossed the path, with one hand. His left hand still ached a little, but he chopped, methodically, precisely, with force. In an hour, he cleared as much as the others had in half a daily. The work was hard and monotonous. Remove a rock, chop down a root, fill in the hole, tamp down the earth, again and again. Jun Ho worked alongside everyone else. His hands were covered with calluses upon calluses. His fingernails were broken. By evening, his back ached so much he couldn't straighten up. But every day the road grew longer. 10 meters, 20, 50. By the 5th day, it stretched 200 meters from the cave. Smooth, cleared. Not perfect, but you could roll a cart along it without stopping. Jun Ho rolled the cart along the finished section, and it traveled 200 meters without a single stop. The wheels rolled smoothly. The pots on the platform didn't bounce. Nae stood at the end of the road and watched. She had walked this path 1,000 times over the past 10 years, with pots on her back, with pain between her shoulder blades. Now a cart was rolling along this path, easily, quickly, without pain. On the 6th day of work on the road, something happened that Jun Ho hadn't anticipated. Tari came, not to him, to Borak. She spoke quietly, at length. Borak listened with a stony expression. Then he came to Jun Ho. Teo translated. Tari says this: a road is a good thing, but a road leads both ways. You can leave via it, you can come along it. Who will come along this road? What will come along this road? Jun Ho stopped. He hadn't thought of that. In his mind, the road was a tool, a way to get from point A to point B faster. But Tari saw what he had overlooked. A path isn't just about convenience. A path is a connection, and a connection works both ways. If he can get to the stream quickly, that means something can get from the stream to the cave quickly. Raptors, other tribes, anything. He sat down on a rock and thought. Tari was right. Not entirely, but she was right in some ways. A road without protection is an invitation, and he needed to take that into account. The solution came that same evening. Not a wall, not a fence, a lookout post. A spot halfway along the road from which both directions are visible, a tall rock or a tree, a place from which a person can look out and see who's coming. He explained it to Borak. He drew it in the sand, a road, a circle in the middle, a person inside the circle, eyes looking in both directions. Borak understood, and for the first time ever, he looked not at Jun Ho, but at Tari.
briefly, almost imperceptibly, but Jun Ho noticed. The chief acknowledged that the shaman had seen what the outsider had missed. Balance. Borak maintained the balance between them. And at that moment, Jun Ho truly respected the old man with the scar across his face for the first time. Borak wasn't just a strong man with an axe. He was a politician.
He led people, and he'd been doing it longer and better than Jun Ho ever could.
The observation post was built in 2 days. A large rock on a hillock beside the road, and the rock a platform big enough for one person. A small shelter made of branches to protect from the rain. A view extending 200 meters in both directions. Borak stationed one of the teenagers there for the day shift. The boy sat and watched. If he saw anything, he shouted. A simple system, but it worked. Tari looked at the post. She didn't say anything, but Jun Ho noticed that her shoulders had relaxed slightly. He heard her. He took her advice. He didn't say she was right because he couldn't find the words, but he did what she suggested, and that was enough. Bye. They finished the path to the stream on the 12th day, 800 meters of flat, packed earth with 2 gentle curves and 1 observation post in the middle. Jun Ho stood at the beginning of the path and looked at it. 800 meters of dirt cleared of rocks and roots. It was nothing, a speck of sand. In Seoul, he'd drive 800 meters in 40 seconds. Here, 800 meters had taken 7 people 12 days of work. But those 800 meters were the first road in the history of this world. The first line drawn by a human between 2 points, telling nature, "You're not in charge here." He pushed a water cart along this road, and the wheels rolled smoothly, and the pots stood upright, and Nay walked beside him carrying a yoke with 2 light pots on her shoulders, smiling. And Jun Ho thought, 1 road, 800 meters. If he built another one to the collection area, and another one down to the river, and another one to the south, toward the salt, how far would that be? Thousands of meters, tens of thousands, months of work. Years. But every meter means less pain in someone's back. Every meter means 1 minute less on the road. And if he could connect with these meters, caves that know nothing of one another, if people who have never seen each other suddenly get the chance to exchange food and words, then 800 meters of mud will become the beginning of something for which he doesn't yet have a name. But it will have one. He was sure of it. It will have one. The expedition for salt began on the 32nd day. Jun Ho spent 3 days preparing for it. He loaded the cart with a 10-day supply of smoked meat. He placed 2 pots of water on it. He rolled up a hide to sleep on. He tied a spare wheel, which he had carved out in advance, to the frame of the handcar. Theo wanted to go with him. Nay wouldn't let him. The boy stood at the cave entrance and looked at Jun Ho with an expression of devoted affection. Jun Ho crouched down in front of him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He pointed to the cave. He pointed to the cart. He pointed to the road. "You're in charge here while I'm gone. Keep an eye on the smokehouse. Keep an eye on the road." Theo pressed his lips together and nodded. He was just a boy, but in this world, boys grew up fast. Kessin was waiting at the start of the road. He stood there with 2 spears and a stone knife strapped to his belt. His hand had healed. The synthetic fabric bandage was still on his shoulder, but beneath it, the skin had closed over into a clean scar. Jun Ho hadn't asked him to come. Kessin didn't offer. He simply stood by the road at dawn, fully equipped. Borak was standing nearby too. He looked at Kessin. He looked at Jun Ho. He said 1 word to Kessin. Kessin nodded. Borak slapped Jun Ho on the shoulder. It hurt again. Again, it felt like a slab of stone. Then he turned and went into the cave. The 2 of them set off, Jun Ho on the handcar, Kessin on foot. The first 800 meters along the road passed quickly. The handcar rolled smoothly. Kessin walked alongside it with long, measured strides. Then the road ended, and the jungle began. The first day was bearable. There was no trail, but Kessin knew the forest. He led Jun Ho along a route that bypassed the thickest thickets. They had to carry the handcar on their shoulders every 100 meters. The wheels got stuck in the roots, the frame snagged on branches. By noon, Jun Ho was cursing everything under the sun. His hands were scraped raw, his back was drenched in sweat. The handcar weighed 20 kilograms but felt like a metric ton. Kessin walked ahead and never once looked back. He didn't help with the handcar. His job was different. He listened to the forest, every sound, every rustle, every crack of a branch. His eyes scanned the trees without stopping. 3 times on the first day, he raised his hand and they froze. Once, a herd of small bipedal dinosaurs passed by, fast and skittish. They dashed past 30 meters away and vanished. The second time, Kessin pointed to a tree ahead. Jun Ho looked but saw nothing. Kessin jabbed his spear toward the trunk, and then Jun Ho saw it. A snake. No, not a snake. Something with paws. Long, green, coiled around the trunk, about the size of his leg. It wasn't moving, it was waiting. They circled around the tree. The third time was worse. Kessin stopped, raised his hand, pressed a finger to his lips. His body tensed. The spear dropped horizontally. Jun Ho froze. Silence. Then he heard it. Breathing. Heavy, steady. Something enormous was breathing behind the thicket to the right. It wasn't moving. It was sleeping. Kessin slowly, very slowly, step by step, led him to the left, in an arc, away from the breathing. They walked like that for 20 minutes, in silence, on tiptoe, with the handcar that Jun Ho carried on his shoulders so the wheels wouldn't squeak. When they had moved far enough away, Kessin exhaled. He turned to Jun Ho and said a single word. Teo had taught him that word. It meant, the one who roars and makes the earth shake. Tyrannosaurus. They spent the night in a tree. Kessin found a tree with a fork 5 meters up, high enough that the raptors couldn't reach them. They tied themselves to the branches with vines. They left the handcar below. Jun Ho didn't sleep. He lay on a branch and stared into the darkness. At night, the forest sounded like a factory, chirping, clicking, hooting, a growl in the distance, rustling in the foliage beneath them. Something was moving around the tree, small creatures, maybe several of them. They snorted and scraped their claws against the bark. They tried to climb up. They couldn't. They left. Kessin was asleep, or pretended to be asleep. His hand rested on his spear even in his sleep. Jun Ho thought that this man had lived like this his whole life, every night, every day, in constant anticipation of death. And yet he got up every morning and went hunting. No scooter, no GPS, no insurance, just a stick with a burnt end and a stone knife. And he survived. 28 years, in a world where the average life expectancy was probably around 30. Kessin was a hero, a real one. Not the kind who makes wheels out of wood, but the kind who stands between people and their teeth every single day. And Jun Ho promised himself that someday he would tell him that, when he'd learned enough words. The second day was worse than the first. They emerged from the forest onto an open plain, and Jun Ho saw the horizon of this world for the first time. A flat land covered with tall grass all the way to the edge of the sky. The grass came up to his chest, yellow, dry, rustling in the wind. Something was moving in the grass, constantly. Paths worn by bodies, trampled patches, tracks. Kessin walked across the open plain at a different pace, faster, shorter strides. He didn't want to linger here. Jun Ho could finally ride the handcar. The ground was level, firm. He sat down and pushed off. The handcar rolled away. The grass whipped against his legs. The wheels crushed the dry stalks. He was moving faster than Kessin was walking. The hunter looked at him, looked at the handcar. His face twitched, not a smile, a shadow of surprise. He quickened his pace. Jun Ho picked up speed. Kessin sped up even more. It turned into a sort of race, a silent, serious one. Kessin was running. Jun Ho pushed off with all his might. The handcar raced across the plain, bouncing over the bumps. The wind whipped his face. The grass parted. And for a few minutes in this deadly world, Jun Ho felt something he hadn't felt since riding his scooter through Gangnam at night. Speed. Freedom. They stopped at the same time, breathing heavily. Kessin bent over, resting his hands on his knees. Jun Ho sat on the handcar, his heart pounding. They looked at each other. And Kessin did something he'd never done before. He smiled, briefly, with just one corner of his mouth, and pointed at the handcar, then at himself. His gesture was clear. "Let me try." Jun Ho climbed down. Kessin sat down. He pushed off. He rode off. Wobbly. He almost fell. He steadied himself. He rode more smoothly, faster. His legs were longer and stronger than Jun Ho's. He picked up speed to a pace the handcar had never reached before. He raced across the plain and braked, kicking up a cloud of dust. He got off. He looked at the handcar. He looked at Jun Ho. And he spoke a long sentence from which Jun Ho understood two words. Good. Fast. That was more than Kessin had said in the entire previous month. On the third day, they found salt. Kessin sensed it first. He stopped and sniffed the air. He pointed to the southwest. They turned off the path. They passed through a grove of low trees with thick trunks. They came out at a cliff. Below was a lake. No, not a lake. A dried-up lake. A white bottom covered with a crust, glistening in the sun. Salt. A whole field of salt. Jun Ho climbed down the cliff. He got down on his knees. He scraped the surface with his fingernails. He licked it. Salty, bitter. Not pure salt, mixed with minerals and dirt, but salty, definitely salty. He stared at the white field and his hands trembled. Not from fatigue, from realization. It was a deposit, a natural reserve, inexhaustible. As much salt as he could carry, as much as he could haul away, as much as he needed to cure meat for months to come, to make cheese, to salt fish, to preserve vegetables. It wasn't just salt, it was freedom from hunger. He stuffed the leather sacks with salt until they began to tear. He loaded the cart. He tied the sacks to the frame of the handcar. Kessin watched him and shook his head. Too much, too heavy. We won't be able to haul it. Jun Ho didn't listen. He kept stuffing and stuffing. In the end, they took so much that they had to drag the handcar instead of riding it. Kessin silently grabbed the other side of the frame and they dragged it together. The return trip took 4 days instead of 3. The load slowed them down. Jun Ho rubbed his feet raw until they blistered. Kessin carried 2 sacks on his back in addition to what was on the cart. He didn't complain. He never complained at all. On the second day of the return trip, they came across a set of tracks. Kessin stopped and crouched down. He touched the ground. He pointed them out to Jun Ho. Footprints. Not from an animal, from a human. Bare feet. 2 people, maybe 3, heading east, recently. Jun Ho looked at Kessin. The hunter was staring at the tracks with an expression Jun Ho couldn't read. Caution, but not fear. People. Other people. Another tribe. Kessin stood up and pointed east. He said a word. Jun Ho didn't know it. Then Kessin pointed at himself, at his face. He ran his finger from his ear to his chin along a scar he didn't have, a scar that Borak had. Jun Ho understood. Borak had gotten his scar from these people, from a neighboring tribe. They weren't friends. Kessin quickened his pace, and they walked past the tracks without stopping. But Jun Ho remembered. There are people downstream, others, strangers. And there is a history between them and Borak's tribe, a history marked by scars. Salt changed everything. During the first week after his return, Jun Ho worked non-stop. He salted the meat, cut it into thin strips, rubbed it with salt, hung it on vines in the shade of the cave. After 3 days, the strips had hardened. After 5 days, they were dry and tough and no longer smelled of rot. He gave a piece to Borak. The chief chewed for a long time. He swallowed. He looked at the strips hanging there. There were 30 of them, 30 portions of meat that wouldn't spoil for 2 weeks, maybe 3, maybe a month.
No one in the tribe had ever seen so much food that didn't rot. Borak stood there and counted. Jun Ho watched him count. 30 portions for 23 people, a day and a half supply. If they could salt just as much again, and more, then they could survive the rain. They could survive a failed hunt. They could survive a week without a catch and not send hunters into the forest when raptors were roaming there. The second step was cheese. Jun Ho knew the theory. Milk, acid, salt, heat, time. The problem was the milk. There were no cows in this world. There were no goats. There were some small herbivores with crests on their heads, about the size of a large dog. They grazed in herds by the river. Theo pointed them out to Jun Ho from the observation post. Jun Ho asked if they produced milk. Theo looked at him as if he'd asked whether rocks could fly. Milk? Yes, all the females with their young produced milk. Theo knew that, but no one had ever tried to milk them. Why bother? It's easier to kill and eat them. Jun Ho explained. Not good. He drew in the sand. An animal. Milk. Something new made from milk. Food that doesn't spoil. Theo listened. His eyes gradually widened. He was beginning to understand. It wasn't certain that he understood exactly what Jun Ho wanted to do, but he understood that the stranger had once again come up with something that would change the world. Catching a small dinosaur turned out to be harder than Jun Ho had thought. They were fast, nervous, skittish. For 3 days, he and Theo tried to get close to the herd. For 3 days, the herd ran away. On the 4th day, Kason came and silently took the rope from them. He left alone. He returned 2 hours later with a small female tied up. The female had huge, frightened eyes and a short crest on her head. She struggled and squealed. Kason tied her to a rock near the cave and left. He didn't say a word. Jun Ho and Theo looked at the female. She looked at them. She squealed. She tugged at the rope. An hour later, she quieted down. 2 hours later, she began chewing the grass that Theo had placed in front of her. A day later, she stopped squealing at the sight of people. 3 days later, Nay stroked her crest and the female closed her eyes. Jun Ho didn't know how to milk her. He'd never milked anything in his life, but he'd seen it done in documentaries. Sit down next to her, take hold of the udder, pull down, gently, rhythmically. The milk will flow. He sat down next to the female. She glanced at him. He found the udder. It was small, 4 teats. He pulled. The female jerked. She kicked him in the thigh. It hurt. He jumped back. He tried again. The female flinched again. Nay walked over and sat down next to him. She placed her hand on the female's neck. She stroked her. She whispered something. The female calmed down. Nay looked at Jun Ho and pointed to the udder. Go ahead. He pulled again. This time the female didn't flinch. The milk started flowing, a thin white stream. It fell into the clay bowl, drop by drop. The bowl filled slowly. By the end, he had a third of the bowl. 200 grams, maybe 250. The milk was yellow and thick. It smelled like grass and something unfamiliar. Not goat's milk, not cow's milk. Something completely different. Jun Ho tasted it. Rich, slightly sweet, with a flavor he couldn't describe. Not bad. It'll do. He added berry juice to the milk, that same sour, fermented kind. He stirred it. He covered the bowl with a piece of hide. He placed it in a warm spot by the cave wall, and he waited. 2 days later, he opened the bowl. The milk had thickened. A clear liquid had separated on top. A white mass had settled at the bottom. Curd, coarse, uneven, but curd nonetheless. He poured off the liquid, salted the mass, kneaded it with his hands, shaped it into a lump, placed it on a flat stone, covered it with another stone on top, pressed down. To press. After a day, he removed the top stone. Beneath it lay a flat cake, white, dense. He broke off a piece and tasted it. Salty, sour, tough. Unlike any cheese he'd ever tasted in Seoul. But it was cheese, the first cheese in the history of this world. He gave a piece to Teo. The boy chewed with his eyes closed. He opened them, swallowed, and said a phrase that Jun Ho would remember forever, even in a foreign language. Milk that didn't run away. Theo didn't know he'd coined a metaphor, but he had, and it was perfect. Cheese became the second miracle after salt. Nay mastered the process in 3 days. She was the best student. Not Theo with his engineer's mind. Nay, because she understood food. She could sense when the milk was ready for culturing. She could sense how much salt was needed. She could sense how much pressure to apply. A week later, she was making cheese that was better than the one Jun Ho had made. Firmer, smoother, more flavorful. He stood nearby, watching her work, and thought that back in Seoul, she would have been a chef. Not a delivery person bringing other people's food, but someone who creates it. By the end of the 2nd month, the cave had something it had never had before. A food supply. A real one. Salted meat strung on ropes. 7 heads of cheese wrapped in leaves and lying in a cool niche deep inside the cave. Smoked meat in the smokehouse. Dried fruit, roots. This would be enough to last 2 weeks without hunting. 2 weeks. For people who had lived day to day their entire lives, it felt like an eternity. The tribe's behavior changed. The women began to laugh more often. The children played longer. The hunters went out not every day, but every other day. In their free time, they sharpened their spears, mended hides, and sat by the fire talking. For the first time in their lives, they had time to talk. Before, every minute had been devoted to survival. Now there were moments when they didn't have to survive. And they didn't know what to do with them. But they were learning, slowly, clumsily, just as children learn to walk. But they were learning. Tari had been silent for 3 weeks now. She sat on her platform and watched. She ate salted meat and cheese and didn't say a word. Her granddaughter, Ari, came to her every evening and sat beside her. Ari was 19. She was as thin and sharp as her tongue. Jun Ho had noticed her before, but hadn't spoken to her. She stayed in her grandmother's shadow. She helped her with the herbs. She brought her food. She spoke to her quietly. But Jun Ho saw how Ari looked at the smokehouse, at the cheese, at the handcar. Not with fear like Tari, with hunger. Not physical hunger, with the hunger of a mind that wants to understand, that wants to know how and why and what else can be done. Contact with the second tribe didn't go the way Jun Ho had planned. He hadn't had time to prepare. He hadn't had time to come up with a diplomatic approach. He hadn't even had time to decide which way to go. The encounter happened on its own. On the 65th day, the lookout on duty shouted. Teo ran first. Jun Ho followed him. People were coming down the road, 5 of them, 2 men with spears, 1 woman, 2 teenagers. They walked slowly, cautiously. Their spears were lowered, but not cast aside. The men looked at the road beneath their feet, and Jun Ho saw their eyebrows creep upward. Flat ground. Cleared. They had never seen anything like it. The woman was carrying a sack on her back, a heavy one. She was hunched over under its weight. The teenagers were thin, very thin. You could see their ribs through their skin. Borak stepped out with an axe. Kessin stood behind him with a spear. 2 men from the foreign tribe stopped. One of them stepped forward. He was older than Borak, gray hair, a scar on his left arm, a long one. Old. He raised his right hand, palm forward. The same gesture that Jun Ho had used on the first day. A universal gesture. I am unarmed with this hand. Borak did not raise his hand. He stood and watched. The gray-haired man began to speak. His language was different, similar but different, as if it were the same language but with a different accent and different words for the same things. Borak listened. His face remained motionless. The gray-haired man spoke at length. He pointed at the woman, at the teenagers, at his stomach, at the forest. Jun Ho didn't understand the words, but he understood the gestures. They're hungry. They've come a long way. They're asking. Borak remained silent when the gray-haired man finished, for a long time. Then he turned to Tari. The shaman stood at the entrance to the cave. She said 3 words, short, harsh. Fio whispered the translation. Not ours. No. Dangerous. Borak looked at Jun Ho. Jun Ho didn't know why he looked at the stranger at that moment. Maybe because Jun Ho, too, had once stood in that spot. He, too, had been a stranger. He, too, had begged. Jun Ho looked at the teenagers, skinny, with sunken eyes, with arms that hung limply at their sides like whips. He looked at the woman, at her back bent under the weight of the sack, at her legs covered in scrapes. They'd been walking a long way, maybe for days, and they were hungry. He turned and went into the cave. He returned a minute later. In his hands he carried strips of salted meat, 3 of them, and a piece of cheese. He walked past Borak, past Kessin with his spear. He approached the gray-haired man and held out the food. He said the phrase he'd said 1,000 times. Hello, here's your order. The gray-haired man looked at the meat, at the cheese, at Jun Ho. His hands trembled as he took the food. He passed the meat to the teenagers. They began to eat, greedily, quickly, choking. The woman received the cheese. She took a small bite. She chewed slowly. Tears streamed down her face, not because of the taste, because of relief. Borak watched this and said nothing. Tari watched and said nothing. Kessin watched and lowered his spear by 3 centimeters. Jun Ho turned to Borak. He pointed at the guests.
He pointed at the cave. He pointed at himself. I take responsibility. Borak looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, briefly, once. The guests were led into the cave. They were seated at the entrance, not by the wall, not by the fire, but at the entrance. The middle spot, the place for those whose status is still undecided. The gray-haired man's name was Gorak. He was the chief of the tribe from beyond the eastern ridge, the very same tribe whose tracks Jun Ho and Kessin had seen on their way back from the salt flats, the very same tribe that had left Borak with a scar across his face. But Gorak was no warrior. He was an old man who had come to ask for help. His tribe was starving. The herd of herbivores had headed south 2 months ago and hadn't returned. The hunt had yielded nothing. 3 hunters had been killed by raptors over the past month. Of the 27 people, only 20. 5 children had gone without food for 2 days. Gorak had heard from hunters who had wandered far to the west that beyond the mountain range there was a tribe where food never ran out, where meat hung on ropes and did not rot, where people rode strange contraptions with wheels. He didn't believe it. Then his youngest grandson began to cry from hunger and could not stop. Gorak got up and headed west. It was a 4-day journey through raptor territory. He knew he might not make it. He went anyway. 5 out of 20. The chieftain and the 4 he could take without completely weakening the tribe. Jun Ho listened to Theo's translation. The boy translated slowly. Gorak's language differed from Borak's, and Teo didn't understand everything. But the main points were clear. Hunger, death, a plea. Jun Ho sat and thought. A 4-day journey to the east, 20 starving people, 5 children. He looked at the supplies in the cave: salted meat, cheese, smoked meat, dried fruit. A 2-week supply for 23 people, if they gave some to Gorak. How much? A third. That would cut their supply down to 10 days, half, down to a week. Unacceptable. But 20 people were starving. 5 of them were children. He calculated again, just as he used to calculate roots and soul. Distance, time, weight, load capacity. If he loaded the cart with meat and salt, if he took the handcar, 4 days on foot, how long would that be by handcar? 2, maybe 2.5. Faster across the plain, slower through the forest. He could deliver the food and return in 5 days. 5 days.
If he left the tribe a 10 days supply, minus what he'll take for the delivery, there'll be enough for 7 or 8 days. That'll be enough. It should be enough. The Gorak tribe lived in a cave on the eastern slope of the mountain range. The cave was smaller than Borak's, lower, cramped. The entrance was narrow and faced north. The cold wind blew in constantly. When Jun Ho entered, he saw the people and his throat tightened. 20 people. 15 of them were lying down. They weren't sitting, they were lying down. They didn't have the strength to sit. The children were small and quiet, the kind of silence that comes when a child can no longer cry because crying requires energy. The women looked ashen. The men looked hollow. 2 hunters stood at the entrance with spears, but their hands were shaking. One of them was coughing, a wet cough. It was a heavy cough, like that of the old man from the Baraka tribe. Only this hunter was about 25 years old. Jun Ho unloaded the cart. Meat, salt, cheese, dried fruit. He laid out the food on a rock by the entrance. People watched. No one moved. Gorak said something, a short remark. The women stood up. They approached. They began handing out the food to the children. The first child to take a piece of salted meat chewed so slowly that Jun Ho thought he didn't have the strength to move his jaw. Then the boy swallowed, and his eyes lit up, as if someone had turned on the light in an empty room. He reached for a second piece. His mother gave it to him. He ate, and with every piece there was more and more life in his eyes. Jun Ho looked away. He couldn't bear to watch, not because it was scary, because he was ashamed. He had been building wheels and handcars and roads, and for the past 4 days' journey away, children were dying of hunger. He could have arrived sooner. He could have found out sooner. He could have avoided waiting for Gorak to come on his own. But he didn't know, and that ignorance was what he wanted to destroy forever. No child in this world should go hungry just because someone didn't know he was starving. They spent 3 days in Gorak's cave. Jun Ho didn't just leave the food and drive away. He taught. He showed Gorak the smokehouse. He drew a diagram: stones, a pit, fire, smoke, meat. Gorak listened and nodded. His people listened too. The woman with the sack turned out to be the best hide worker in the entire eastern tribe. Her name was Dara. She treated the hides so that they became as soft as cloth. The Borak tribe didn't have such skills, and their hides were stiff and coarse. Dara worked differently. She chewed the leather, for hours, for days. She soaked it in fat, kneaded it, chewed it again. The result was stunning. Soft, thin leather that could be bent and folded, perfect for belts, for bags, for clothing. Jun Ho looked at her work and thought, this is it. This is why trade is necessary. Not because someone has something to spare, but because everyone has something that someone else doesn't. On the second day, something happened that Jun Ho hadn't expected. One of the Gorak women brought a girl to him, a little girl, about 6 or 7 years old, skinny to the point of being transparent. The girl didn't speak at all. The woman explained through Gorak. The girl was from another tribe, a third one, the one that no longer existed. A raptor raid at night. The tribe hadn't had time to flee. Gorak's hunters found the girl 2 days later, alone, in a pit beneath the roots of a tree.
She was sitting there with her dead younger brother, not moving a muscle. They took her in. She hadn't spoken since then. 3 months, not a word. She just sat there and stared. Jun Ho crouched down in front of her. The girl looked right through him. Her eyes were empty, not dead, empty, like a screen that had been turned off. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a psychologist. He wasn't a doctor. He was a courier. But he knew one thing. Sometimes a person doesn't need words. Sometimes you just need to be there. He sat down next to her. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just sat there. An hour later, she still hadn't looked at him, nor after 2 hours. But when he stood up to leave, her hand twitched, just a little, toward him. And it stopped. He noticed. He sat back down. He stayed there for another hour. When he stood up again, her hand twitched once more, this time a little farther. He looked at her. She was staring at the floor, but her hand was reaching toward him. He held out his own hand, palm up, open. She didn't take it, but she didn't pull away either. Progress. Small, almost invisible, but progress. He learned her name from the woman who had brought her, So-yeon. On the 3rd day, as they were getting ready to leave, Jun Ho approached Gorak. He pointed at So-yeon. He pointed at himself. He pointed west. Gorak understood. He looked at the girl. He looked at Jun Ho. He nodded.
He didn't have the strength to feed another mouth, and the girl didn't speak, didn't work, and didn't help. For a starving tribe, she was a burden. Gorak knew that. He hated himself for knowing this, but he knew. Jun Ho took So-yeon by the hand. This time, she let him. Her fingers were thin and cold. She stood up and followed him. She didn't look back at Horak's cave. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She just walked. A small shadow in a big world full of teeth. The way back. The cart was full. Hides. Soft, tanned hides. 20 of them. Kessin was carrying some on his back. So-yeon sat on the handcar. Jun Ho pulled the handcar behind him. She weighed nothing, less than a sack of salt. Kessin walked along, glancing at the girl. His face was inscrutable. But once, when So-yeon slipped on a rock, he caught her, quickly, instinctively, just as one catches a child. He set her back on her feet. Then he kept walking. Jun Ho saw it and said nothing. There was no need. On the 2nd day of their journey, something happened that changed everything in Jun Ho's mind. They were passing through a gorge, a narrow one. The walls rose 10 meters on both sides. Kessin was walking in front and stopped. He raised his hand. Jun Ho froze. Kessin pointed at the gorge wall, at a rock. Jun Ho walked over and looked. There were drawings on the rock. Old ones, faded, covered in moss. He brushed the moss away with his hand, and his heart stopped for a second. A wheel. A wheel was drawn on the rock, a circle with an axle. Next to it was something that looked like a cart, 4 wheels, a platform, and another drawing, a diagram. He couldn't make it out completely, but he could see the lines, an axle, a mounting, something that looked like a bearing. The drawings weren't fresh. Moss had been growing over them for years, decades, maybe centuries. Someone had been here before him. Someone had drawn a wheel on the stone. Someone knew what an axle and a bearing were. Someone from his world, or from a world similar to his. Someone who had also ended up here, and tried, and drew, and built. Jun Ho stood in front of the wall, his hands trembling. He ran his fingers over the drawing. The stone was cold. The lines were shallow.
The person who drew this was in a hurry, or perhaps he didn't have good tools, but he knew. He knew about wheels, about axles, about mechanics. He was an engineer, or something like that. And he had been here a long time ago. A very long time ago. And he was gone. No trace, no legend, no name. Only drawings on the stone that only someone who knew what a bearing was could read. Kesson stood nearby and waited. He saw the drawings, but to him they were just lines on a stone. He didn't know what they meant. Jun Ho looked at him, then at So-Yun, who was sitting on the handcar, staring into space, then back at the wall. Someone had already tried. Someone had already failed. And nothing remained of him, only drawings that no one can read. Jun Ho ran his hand over his face. Sweat, dirt, fear. If that man, with all his knowledge, couldn't do it, if everything he built vanished without a trace, what's to stop this from happening again? To him, to his wheel, his smokehouse, and his road. What if 200 years from now, all that remains of Jun Ho is a drawing on a rock that no one can read? The third month began when So-Yun spoke, not with words, a sound. She stood by the tether of a small female dinosaur and looked at her. The female chewed grass and glanced at the girl out of the corner of one eye. So-Yun reached out her hand. The female sniffed it, licked it. So-Yun made a sound, something between an exhalation and a whisper. Not a word, but not silence either. Nay stood nearby and froze. She looked at So-Yun, at her hand resting on the female's head, at her lips from which a sound had emerged for the first time in months. Nay slowly stepped back, not to interfere, give the girl some space. So-Yun stroked the female and breathed quietly onto her crest. The female closed her eyes. They stood there for a long time. Two small figures at the edge of the clearing in front of the cave, one covered in scales, the other covered in scars that couldn't be seen. Jun Ho watched from a distance. He didn't approach. He saw how So-Yun reacted to the animal, not to people. She looked right through people. She turned away from them, but the animal was safe. The animal couldn't betray her. It couldn't disappear at night. It couldn't be killed by raptors. Well, it could, but the dinosaur's small brain didn't know that, and its calmness was contagious. A week later, So-Yun was spending the whole day with the female. She fed her, she groomed her, she stroked her crest, and she began to make more sounds, not words, sounds, but purposeful ones. She was talking to the female, in a language she'd made up herself. A low hum meant, stay calm. A short click meant, come here. A long whistle meant, stay. The female obeyed, not right away. But after 2 weeks, she was following So-Yun without a leash. She'd stop at a whistle. She'd sit at a hum. Jun Ho watched this, his jaw dropping. 6 years, or 7. A small, quiet girl had just tamed a dinosaur better than he could ever have dreamed. By the beginning of the 4th month, Jun Ho's world had expanded to dimensions that had seemed impossible just a short time ago. 2 tribes, 2 routes, the road from the cave to the stream, the trail across the ridge to the Gorak tribe, the route to the salt lake. 3 lines on the map he'd drawn with charcoal on a flat stone and hung on the cave wall. Ari had added her own pictograms to the map. The salt lake was marked with a circle and a dot. The Gorak cave was marked with a triangle. Their cave was marked with a square. Lines connected them, and on each line were small dashes, days of travel. It was the first map in the history of this world, rough, inaccurate, but a map. Gorak sent his men 2 weeks after the first delivery. 3 of them arrived with bundles of hides, soft, tanned, 20 pieces, plus 5 pieces of flint, which wasn't found in Borak Valley. Flint was valuable, sharp. It was used to make the best knives. Jun Ho loaded the return cart with meat, salt, and cheese. He sent it off with Theo and one of Borak's hunters, the first route without him. He stood at the lookout post and watched as Theo walked down the trail with the cart.
The boy turned around once, waved, and disappeared around the bend. Jun Ho stood and watched him go, thinking that this moment was more important than the first wheel, more important than the first road, more important than salt. Because this was the moment when the system began to function without him. Teo knew the route. He knew what to carry. He knew who to give it to. He knew what to bring back. Jun Ho wasn't needed on this route. The delivery system ran on its own. Theo returned 6 days later, safe and sound, with a cart full of hides and flint, and with news. Gorak has a neighbor, another tribe, to the southeast, a small one, 15 people. They live by the river and catch fish, lots of fish, but they have no salt and no meat. They're willing to trade, fish for salt. Jun Ho looked at the map. He added another triangle in the southeast between him and the salt lake. He drew a line, another route, another tribe, another point on the map. 3 tribes, 3 routes. This was no longer just a road, it was a network.
He spent the evening making calculations. He drew on a stone, erased it, drew again. 3 tribes. The Baraka tribe produces salted meat and cheese. The Gorak tribe produces soft hides and flint. The River tribe produces fish. Each needs what the others have. The Borak to Gorak route takes 4 days. The Gorak to River tribe route takes 2 days, according to Theo. The direct route from Borak to the River tribe is unknown. It needs to be scouted. If he maps out a direct route from their cave to the River tribe, it will form a triangle. 3 points, 3 routes. Goods circulate in a loop. Meat and cheese go east, hides and flint go south, fish go west. Everyone gets what they don't have, everyone gives away what they have in excess. No one goes hungry, no one goes to war. Because if you kill your neighbor, you'll lose their goods, and tomorrow you won't have any hides, or fish, or salt. Ari sat nearby and took notes. Her pictograms were becoming more complex. She devised symbols for each commodity, for the routes, for the quantities. A circle with a tail meant meat. A circle with a wave meant fish. A circle with a dot meant salt. She recorded how much meat Gorak had sent out, how many hides had come back, how many days the route took. It was bookkeeping, the first bookkeeping in this world, and she kept it on stones because paper didn't exist. Jun Ho looked at her records and thought that this 19-year-old girl with a sharp tongue and eyes full of hungry curiosity was the most valuable person on his team. Not because she was the smartest, although she was, but because she did what he couldn't. She translated his knowledge into a form that this world could remember. The 5th month brought the first serious problem of a new kind. Kason came to see him in the evening. He sat down across from him. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, slowly, choosing simple words. I used to be the leader. I used to bring home the meat. Everyone ate because I hunted. Everyone lived because I killed the beast. Now the meat hangs on ropes. Cheese lies among the rocks. The children eat every day, not because I hunted, because you salted it, because you brought it. I stand here with my spear and don't know why. Jun Ho listened. He knew this would happen. Kason was the best hunter. His worth was defined by the meat he brought back. Now everyone had meat all the time, and Kason had lost his place, not in the tribe, in his own mind. He didn't know who he was if not a hunter. Like a courier who'd lost his job. Like a taxi driver replaced by autopilot. Technological progress devours professions, even in the Stone Age. Jun Ho thought about it for 3 days. Then he went to see Kason. He sat down next to him and said, I have a job for you, a new one, an important one, more important than hunting. Kason looked at him. Jun Ho took out a stone with a map on it. He pointed to 3 dots, 3 tribes, 3 routes, lines connecting them. People with carts travel along these lines. Theo, hunters, teenagers. They carry food, hides, and salt along trails where raptors roam, through the forests where tyrannosaurs sleep,
across the Queens where death lurks in the grass. They need protection. They need someone to lead the way. Someone who hears the forest, someone who senses danger, someone who can lead a pack away from a cart carrying food, someone who can guide the courier safely through the predator's territory. You're the fastest, the quietest. You know the forest better than anyone. I don't need a hunter. I need someone who leads through danger. Casson was silent for a long time. He looked at the map, at the lines connecting the points, at the routes people had taken. His people, the people he was supposed to protect. Then he looked at Jun Ho and nodded, once, briefly, like Borak. And that nod said it all: agreement, understanding, a new goal. He stood up and left. And the next morning he set out on the trail to the Gorak tribe and covered the entire route alone, in 2 days, back in 2. He returned and drew markings on a rock next to Jun Ho's map. There's a pack of raptors here, 10 of them, heading north. There's a burrow here, small but vicious. Go around to the left. There's a watering hole here. A large predator comes at dawn. Don't go in the morning. There's a safe place to spend the night here, a tall tree, a fork in the path 5 meters away. Casson had created the first map of dangers. Jun Ho looked at it and realized that Casson had just become who he had always been, a protector. Only now he wasn't protecting people from hunger. He was protecting those who carried food to others from death. And that was more, much more. In the 6th month, Hana arrived. She appeared on the road accompanied by 4 warriors with spears longer than those of Borak's people. The warriors were large, well-fed, well-dressed in hides tanned just as skillfully as Dara's. Kana walked in front, tall, back straight.
Her head held high, as if the whole world were slightly lower than she was used to. Her hair was braided into a complex plait interwoven with thin strips of leather. Around her neck hung a necklace made of the teeth of some large predator. She walked along the road and looked at it the same way Borak had looked at the first wheel, with the realization that this changed everything. Theo ran after Borak. The chief came out. He saw Hana. His face hadn't changed, but his shoulders had sagged slightly. He knew who she was. Hana was the daughter of Virok, the chief of a large tribe from the south, 40 men, strong, well-armed. Virok's tribe controlled the southern mountain pass, the only route to the river where the fishermen's tribe lived. Without Virok's permission, no one could pass south, and Virok knew this, and he took advantage of it. There was no trade with him. There was only fear. As long as Virok left the Borak tribe alone, but the route to the fishermen passed through his territory, and one day one of his hunters spotted a cart on the road. He saw the wheels, he saw sacks of salt, and he reported it to Virok, and Virok sent his daughter. Not warriors, not an army, his daughter. It was a diplomatic visit, or a reconnaissance mission, or both. Hana spoke to Borak as an equal, not as a guest, not as a supplicant, as a chieftain's daughter who knows her worth. Theo whispered the translation. Her language was closer to Borak's than to Gorak's. She spoke clearly and concisely. My father has heard about the things happening here, about food that doesn't rot, about the things on wheels, about the roads. My father wants to know what this is, who's behind it, and what he wants. Borak turned to Jun Ho. He pointed. There he is. Hana looked at Jun Ho for a long time. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, and they scanned him like a scanner. A dirty yellow jacket, worn-out boots, calluses on his hands, a cracked watch. She saw a stranger, not a leader, not a warrior, not a shaman. A stranger who looked as if he'd been found on the road and forgotten to be thrown away. She wasn't impressed. Jun Ho showed her the smokehouse, cheese, salted meat, the handcar, the cart, the road, the map on the wall, the Ari pictograms. Hana watched in silence. She touched the wheels. She tasted the cheese. Her expression didn't change, but Jun Ho saw her eyes.
And in those eyes was something he recognized: greed. Not a bad kind of greed, not the greed of a thief.
The greed of a person who sees a tool and wants to use it. Hana thought like her father, strategically. Control over technology meant control over the region. If the Virok tribe obtained the wheels, the smokehouses, and the salt, it would become the strongest in the 10 valleys. That evening, Hana sat by the fire and talked with Bork for a long time. Theo grew tired of translating. Ari took his place. She understood Hana's language than Hana's. They talked about trade, about routes, about the passage through the southern mountains. Hana proposed a deal. Her father would open the passage. In exchange, Jun Ho would teach their people how to make wheels and smokehouses. Borak remained silent. He didn't want to share secrets. Secrets were his advantage. But he needed the southern passage. Without it, the route to the fishermen was 3 days longer. Jun Ho listened and thought. Then he stood up. He walked over to the map. He pointed to 3 dots, 3 tribes, 3 routes. He added a 4th dot, the Viroka tribe in the south. He drew lines, 4 dots, 6 routes. He showed it to Hana. Each tribe produces something unique. Each tribe receives what it lacks. Wheels and smokehouses are no secret. They're tools. Tools that only work if everyone uses them. If only one tribe makes cheese and the others don't, there's nothing to trade. If everyone makes cheese but each has something else, trade flourishes. Virok receives the wheels. In return, he doesn't just open a passage. He himself becomes part of the network. His people transport goods across the southern mountains. His hunters guard the southern route. He doesn't lose control. He gains new control, more than before. Hana listened. Her eyes nattered. She was thinking. She was calculating. She was weighing it all up. Then she nodded, slowly. She needed to return to her father, but she understood, and Jun Ho could see that she hadn't just understood. She had seen a place for herself in this scheme. Not as the chieftain's daughter to be married off for the sake of an alliance, as a negotiator, as a liaison, as someone who stands between the tribes and makes sure they talk instead of fighting. The first year ended, and the second began. The network was working. 4 tribes, 6 routes. Carts traveled the trails every 3 days. Meat, salt, fish, hides, flint, cheese. Honey that Gorak's people had learned to gather. Clay that the fishermen had found. Goods moved in a circle, and each tribe had what it hadn't had before. Children weren't starving. Women weren't breaking their backs. Hunters went out on schedule rather than out of desperation. Jun Ho looked at the map that now covered an entire wall of the cave and thought it resembled the route diagram that hung in the office of his delivery service in Seoul. Only instead of streets, there were trails. Instead of scooters, there were carts. Instead of customers, there were tribes. But the principle was the same. Point A, point B, cargo, time, route, delivered. The Gallimimes changed everything. Soyeon tamed her first one a month after she'd gotten used to the little female. The Gallimime was a fast, bipedal dinosaur about the height of a human. Long legs, long neck, small head with a beak. It ran faster than any human, faster than a handcar, faster than almost anything in this world except raptors. Soyeon found a young male by the river. He was standing apart from the herd. He was limping, an injured leg. The herd had abandoned him. He would have died in a day or two. A raptor would have found him at night. Soyeon approached him, alone, unarmed, without a rope, only with a tuft of grass in her hand and strange sounds coming from her throat. A low hum, a click, a whistle. Gallimime looked at her with his enormous eye. He didn't run away. He couldn't run away. She placed the grass in front of him. He lowered his head and began to eat. She sat down next to him. An hour later, he let her touch his neck. 2 days later, she made him a splint for his leg out of sticks and strips of leather. A week later, he was walking. 2 weeks later, he was running. and he never left So-yeon's side, because she was the first creature in his life who hadn't abandoned him when he was broken. She named him Pak, just like her younger brother. Jun Ho learned about this from Nae. Nae told him quietly one evening by the campfire. The boy who had been found dead next to So-yeon in a pit beneath the tree roots was named Pak. He was 4 years old. So-yeon held him for 2 days after he died. She wouldn't let go. When the Gorak hunters found her, they couldn't pry her fingers apart. They had to wait until she fell asleep. Jun Ho listened and said nothing. Then he stood up. He went over to So-yeon. She was sitting next to Park, cleaning his feathers. Yes, the Galamime had feathers, short, stiff, on their necks and backs. Jun Ho sat down next to her. He didn't speak, he just sat there.
So-yeon continued cleaning. 10 minutes later, she said a word. Her first word in the human language in 5 months. Park. She pointed at the Galamime. Park. Jun Ho nodded. Park. So-yeon looked at him, for the first time. Not through, at him. Her eyes were wet, but not empty. There was something alive in them, something warm. Gratitude that he had remembered the name she had never told anyone, that he had understood. Pak became the first transport Galamime. So-yeon taught him to carry a load on his back, a small one, 5 kilograms, then 10, then 15. She wove a basket from vines and tied it to his sides. The Galamime ran with the basket and didn't notice the weight. So-yeon ran alongside him. She ran almost as fast as he did. Slim, light, with legs accustomed to running from death. The first delivery on the Galamime took the time that would have required 2 days by cart. So-yeon reached the Gorak tribe in a single day. Pak carried 10 kilograms of salted meat. She returned the next day, 2 days instead of 5. Kesson stood on the road and watched as So-yeon rode up on a Galamime, and his mouth fell open for a split second. Then it closed. He was Kesson. He didn't show surprise. But Jun Ho saw it. By the middle of the second year, there were 6 Galamimes in the network. So-yeon had trained 2 younglings from the Gorak tribe to handle them. They became the first rider couriers, express delivery, urgent orders, medicines from Ari, who had now systematized the herbs and was making decoctions from them with predictable effects. News, warnings. If Kesson spotted a flock of raptors on the route, a courier on a Galamime would spread the warning to all outposts within half a day. Previously, this would have taken 3 days, during which someone might have died. Information began to travel faster than danger, and that changed the rules. Kesson devised a system of signals, smoke columns. 1 column meant all clear, 2 meant caution, 3 meant danger, 4 meant help. Every lookout post now had a pot filled with dry grass and charcoal. The courier could see the smoke from 10 kilometers away. He would respond with his own column of smoke. Information flew through the network. Kesson became head of security. He no longer hunted, he guarded. And he commanded 3 young hunters whom he had trained himself. Jun Ho had been preparing for the circle for 9 months, not for war, but to ensure that war wouldn't be necessary. The first thing he did was expand the network. Over those months, 3 more tribes had joined the original 4. Small, frightened, hungry. They came on their own. Rumors of food that didn't rot and of the things on wheels spread faster than Jun Ho could build roads. Each new tribe received a smokehouse, salt, wheels, a cheese recipe, and each new tribe became a hub in the network. 7 tribes, 200 people, 15 routes, 6 observation posts, 12 couriers, 8 Galamimes, 4 carts, 2 hand cars, 1 armored 4-wheeled wagon pulled by 2 domesticated Parasaurolophus. These were large herbivorous dinosaurs with crests on their heads, slow but incredibly strong. A single Parasaurolophus could pull a wagon loaded with 300 kilograms without even noticing the weight. Soyeon had domesticated them in 2 months. She became the best trainer in the network, a quiet, reserved girl who spoke 10 words a day and understood animals better than people. The second thing he did was build Central Station, not in Borak's cave, at the crossroads of the routes, in a wide valley where 3 trails converged, a level clearing, stone walls 2 meters high, a gate made of bound tree trunks. Inside, a warehouse for goods, a kitchen with 3 smokehouses, a pen for gallimums and parasaurolophs, a room for couriers, a log watchtower offering a view a kilometer in every direction. 20 people spent 2 months building it. It was the first permanent structure in this world that wasn't a cave, the first building, the first hub in the network that didn't rely on natural cover. Jun Ho stood in front of the station gates, looking at it and thinking that it resembled the distribution center for his delivery service in Seoul. Only it was made of stone and wood, and it had a dinosaur pen. The third thing he did was find Min-ji. No, Min-ji found him. In the 14th month, a woman approached the gates of Central Station, alone, unarmed, wearing clothes made of hides tanned so well they looked like fabric. Her hair was tied back in a bun at the nape of her neck. On her feet were sandals woven from vines. Her face bore the weariness of 10 years spent in a world where there was no one to talk to. She looked at the station walls, at the wheels, at the smokehouses, at the couriers in yellow capes that Nay had sewn from dyed hides, modeled after Jun Ho's jacket. She looked at all of this and wasn't surprised. She knew what it was. She knew where it came from. She looked at Jun Ho, who had stepped out to the gate, at his jacket, at the logo, at the cracked watch,
And she said in Korean, in archaic 18th century Korean that sounded like a song from another world, "You're a merchant too." Jun Ho stood there, unable to speak. He hadn't heard Korean in 10 months. For 10 months, his native language had lived only in his head. And now a woman in furs was standing before him, speaking Korean. Incorrectly, old-fashioned, with turns of phrase that had fallen out of use 300 years ago. But in Korean. He opened his mouth. He closed it, opened it again, and said, "Yes, I'm a courier." She smiled, wearily, like someone who had walked a very long way and had finally arrived. She said, "My name is Min-ji. I used to sell fabrics in Joseon. I've been here for 10 years. I thought I was alone." Her voice faltered on the last word. Jun Ho stepped toward her and, not knowing what to do, held out his hand. She looked at his hand, took it, and held it, for a minute, 2. She didn't let go, because it was the first hand from her own world that she had held in 10 years. Min-ji became the operation's second in command. She knew what Jun Ho didn't. Trade, real trade, not bartering meat for hides, a system, scales, standards. For 10 years, she had traded fabrics throughout 18th century Korea. She knew how to set prices, how to keep records, how to build inventory, how to distribute goods so that everyone received what they needed and nothing more. She looked at Ari's pictograms and said they were good, but more was needed. Numbers were needed, not pictures. Numbers. How much meat was shipped, how many hides were received, how much salt was in stock. Ari listened with eyes ablaze. Over the course of 2 months, they worked together to create a recording system that was a cross between Ari's pictograms and Min-ji's numerical symbols. The first record-keeping, the first bookkeeping, the first step toward writing. Min-ji had brought something else with her, knowledge. She had lived for 10 years among a distant tribe in the north, and during that time she had learned to do things that Jun Ho didn't know how to do. Fabric made from plant fibers, rough, stiff, but fabric, not animal hides. Fabric that could be washed, fabric that didn't start to stink after 2 days, fabric that could be dyed. She showed it to Nay. May looked at the fabric with an expression that Jun Ho recognized, the hunger of a master who had seen a new material.
Within a month, Ney was making fabric better than Minji.
Because Ney sensed the materials in a way Minji never could. That evening, after Minji's first day at the station, Jun Ho made her some tea. Not real tea, a brew made from local leaves that smelled somewhat like jasmine. In a clay cup he'd made himself, on a small wooden coaster that Teo had carved. He placed the cup in front of Minji. She looked at it, at the steam, at the coaster. She picked up the cup, brought it to her lips, took a sip, and froze. She sat there with the cup in her hands, motionless, for 10 minutes. Her eyes were closed. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She wasn't crying. The tears just flowed, like rain that doesn't ask for permission. 10 years. For 10 years, she hadn't drunk tea from a cup. For 10 years, the world had been alien, cold, and stony. And now, a clay cup, hot tea, a wooden coaster, someone who remembers that this is exactly how tea is drunk. Jun Ho sat across from her and said nothing. He knew that words weren't needed right now. Silence was needed. And tea. And the presence of someone who understands why this matters. Krog arrived in the 22nd month. 300 spearmen, 10 combat ceratopses with riders on their backs. An army moving through the valley like a dark wave. Jun Ho stood on the watchtower of Central Station and watched them in the morning light. His stomach was ice cold. His hands were trembling. He gripped the railing and forced himself to count. 300 men, 10 ceratopses, a 4-day journey from Krog's main territories. That meant 4 days without food supplies. 300 men eat a lot, a whole lot. He turned to Hana. She stood beside him, her face as white as chalk, but her voice was steady. She was counting too. She looked at Jun Ho and said, "He won't storm the place right away. He'll talk first. Krog always talks first." She knew more about him than the rest of them. Her people had been gathering intelligence for months. Krog was smart. He didn't waste people on pointless assaults. He gave them a choice. Join us or starve. Join us or die. A simple choice. Krog arrived at the station gates on the 2nd day, alone, unarmed, tall, broad-shouldered, shaved head, scars on his arms. Lots of scars, each from a different battle. His eyes were calm, dark, intelligent. He looked at the station walls, at the gates, at the watchtower, at the couriers in yellow cloaks standing on the walls with spears they didn't really know how to wield. Krog saw that. He saw everything. He looked at Jun Ho and spoke. Hana translated. His language was an Eastern dialect, harsh.
Abrupt, like a bark. He spoke like this.
"I've seen your roads, your contraptions on wheels, your food that doesn't rot. These are good things. I don't want to destroy them. I want to control them. Give me the network. I'll preserve what you've built. My people will travel on your roads. My hunters will guard your routes. You'll stay. You'll build. You'll make new things. But the network will be mine. Because you're kind, and kind people don't know how to hold on to things. Someone will come after me, worse than me, and he won't talk. He'll just take it, and then he'll break it, because he won't understand how it works. I understand. Give it to me, and everything will remain." Jun Ho listened. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweaty, because Krog was right, partly. Jun Ho wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a chieftain. He wasn't an army commander. He was a courier. And 70 couriers with spears wouldn't stop 300 spearmen with combat ceratopses. Krog knew that. Jun Ho knew that. Everyone knew that. But there was one thing Krog didn't know. He didn't know what logistics were. Jun Ho replied. Hana translated. "No." Krog nodded, calmly, as if he'd been expecting it. He stood up.
He left, and the siege began. Krog's army surrounded Central Station. The spearmen formed a ring. The ceratopses blocked 3 of the 4 roads. Krog did not launch an assault. He waited. He knew there was a limited supply of food inside the station. He knew that without resupply, the station would hold out for a week, maybe 2, and then hunger would do its job. He was patient. He could wait. His army fed on what it looted along the way, but Krog didn't know about the 4th road. He blocked off 3 because he saw 3 on his map. His scouts had found 3 routes. They didn't find the 4th because it didn't exist. Jun Ho had built it over the past 2 months, secretly, at night, through a gorge that Khe-san had discovered during his reconnaissance missions. Narrow, dark, inconspicuous. Too narrow for a ceratops, but wide enough for a galamime with a basket. On that very first night, Ye-so headed north along this route. Ye-so, a 28-year-old woman from a tribe that lived on the cliffs. She joined the network 3 months ago, the fastest galamime rider, faster than So-yeon, faster than anyone. She adored speed just as Jun Ho had once adored his scooter. She raced along the trail so fast that the wind whistled, her hair flew, and she laughed at full gallop.
She was the head of express delivery, and now she was carrying an urgent order, the most urgent in the network's history. She slipped through the gorge in the darkness. Pak, galamime So-yeon. She was carrying 20 kilograms of cargo, food, tools, and most importantly, messages. Wooden tags with Ari's pictograms for each of the 7 tribes, identical with a single word, which Ari had burned onto each tag. Help. And instructions, simple, clear. Each tribe had its own task. The Garaka tribe, send 20 hunters to the eastern slope. The Fisherman's tribe, block the southern ford. The Virok tribe, send a supply of food through the southern pass. The northern tribes, light signal fires on the ridges. Ye-so flew from village to village, from outpost to outpost. She handed out tags, she explained, she flew on. In 2 days, she covered the entire network. All 7 tribes knew. All 7 began to move. On the 3rd day of the siege, Krog spotted smoke, not at the station, on the ridges, 4 plumes from all directions. His scouts ran to investigate. They returned with news. People, on the ridges, on the trails, everywhere. They were coming. Krog counted, 20 from the east, 15 from the south, 10 from the north, another 10 from the southwest. They didn't attack, they were just coming. Toward the station, along the roads that Jun Ho had built, along the routes that Khe-san had scouted. They were carrying food, weapons, signal fires, and most importantly, they were carrying a presence. Krog's army stood in a ring around the station, and surrounding Krog's army was yet another ring, made up of people who had come not to fight, but to stand there, to show that they existed, that there were many of them, and that they were united. On the 4th day, the food wagons made their way to the station via the southern passage. Virok's people escorted them. Gorak's hunters provided cover from the east. Couriers on galamimes circled around Krog's camp, cutting off his scouts from the main forces. Kessin coordinated the operation. He stood on a watchtower next to Jun Ho and moved wooden figures across a map drawn on a leather hide. Send this hunter here, move that squad there, reinforce this outpost. His eyes burned. He had found his calling. Not a hunter, not a guide, a commander, a tactician, a warrior who would win the battle without killing anyone. On the 5th day, Krog's army began to starve. 300 men with no resupply. The provisions they'd brought with them were gone. The nearby herds had scattered from the noise of the army. There was no one left to hunt, and all around them, along every trail, wagons carrying food were passing by,
heading toward the station, right past them. The smell of smoked meat and hot bread wafted to Grog's camp with every gust of wind. His spearmen were hungry and angry. His ceratopses were hungry and restless. And outside the station walls, couriers in yellow cloaks were handing out food and smiling. Jun Ho ordered 3 times the usual amount to be prepared. The smokehouses worked day and night. The smell of food was a weapon, the cruelest and most bloodless of all. On the 6th day, 3 of Grog's spearmen defected to the station. They simply came to the gates and asked for food. They were given some, they were fed. They weren't locked up, they weren't disarmed. They were simply fed and allowed to sit by the fire. On the 7th day, 10 more arrived. On the 8th, 20. Grog was losing his army, not in battle. He was losing it through their stomachs. His men were leaving to join those who fed them, because Grog couldn't feed them. But Jun Ho could. On the 9th day, Grog went out to the gates alone, just like the first time, unarmed. His face was gray, not from hunger. It was from understanding. He stood before the gates of Central Station and looked at the walls he hadn't stormed, at the roads along which wagons carrying food traveled, at the couriers in yellow cloaks who rode past his camp on gallimimes and politely nodded to his spearmen. He stood there and understood what he hadn't been able to understand before. He hadn't lost the battle. He had lost the world. His world was simple. The strong take, the weak give. This world was different. In this world, everyone gave and everyone received. And that was stronger than 300 spears. Jun Ho came out to meet him, wearing a yellow jacket, worn, patchworked with pieces of leather and fabric that Nay had woven. The logo on the back was almost worn away, but the little man on a scooter was still faintly visible. The cracked watch on his wrist read 2:07 p.m. Forever. He was carrying a bowl, a clay bowl, hot, a stew of smoked meat with root vegetables and salt, the very same one Nay used to make, the best stew in the 7 tribes. He stopped in front of Grog, looked at him. A big man, strong, fearsome, with scarred hands, with eyes that had seen enough battles to last 10 lifetimes.
Jun Ho held out the bowl to him. He said the phrase he'd said 1,000 times. "Hello, here's your order." Hana, standing behind him, translated. Grog looked at the bowl. He looked at Jun Ho. His jaw tensed. The muscles in his neck bulged. He stood like that for 3 seconds. 5. 10. Then he slowly reached out. He took the bowl. He sat down right on the ground by the gate and began to eat, slowly, silently. Steam rose from the soup in the cold morning air. Grog ate, and his shoulders, which for 2 years had borne the weight of 10 tribes, 300 spearmen, and an endless war for survival, sank with every swallow. He finished eating. He set the bowl down on the ground. He looked at Jun Ho and said one word. Hana translated. More. Jun Ho smiled. He took the bowl. He went to get a second helping. And at that moment, the war ended. Not with a crash, not with screams, with a bowl of soup and the word more. Grog did not become part of the network that day. It took months, negotiations, arguments, terms. Hana worked non-stop. She sat at her stone table and wrote down the agreements. Ari translated them into pictograms. Minji did the math. How much food was needed for the 10 tribes of Grog? How many routes needed to be laid out? How many couriers needed to be trained? How many gallimimes needed to be tamed? The numbers were enormous. The network doubled in size, tripling. 7 tribes became 17, 200 people became 500. And Jun Ho looked at the map, which now covered 3 walls of the station, and thought that this was no longer just a delivery service. This was civilization. Grog became the head of security for the eastern routes, not because Jun Ho wanted to curry favor with him, because Grog was the best tactician Jun Ho had ever met, better than Kesson, better than Borak. Grog looked at the map and read it like a book.
He saw the weak spots. He saw the vulnerabilities. He saw where an outpost was needed, where a flanking maneuver was needed, where a bridge was needed. He didn't build, he defended. And he did it with the same calm with which he had once conquered. Cassin worked with him. Two tacticians, two warriors who found each other on opposite sides of a battle that never was. They argued every day, loudly, with gestures, sometimes with fists. But the routes they guarded were the safest in the region. Not a single courier was killed on the eastern route for the rest of that year. Time passed. Months turned into years.
The second year became the third. The network grew. Roads stretched from tribe to tribe like veins across the body. Stations stood at the crossroads, miniature replicas of the central station, with smokehouses, with warehouses, with pens. Couriers in yellow cloaks became a familiar sight on the trails. Hunters from distant tribes who had never seen a wheel would stop and watch as a wagon passed by. Then they would move on. A month later, they would arrive at the nearest station and ask to be taught. And they were taught, because in Jun Ho's network, knowledge was no secret. Knowledge was a commodity, the most valuable one, and the only one that didn't diminish when it was shared. So-Yun had grown up. She was 10, maybe 11. She spoke, sparingly, quietly, but she spoke. With Ne, who would become her mother, with Teo, who became her brother, with Jun Ho, whom she called by a single word in the tribe's language, the one who stayed. Because everyone in her life had left, her parents, her brother, her tribe, but he stayed. She commanded 12 tamed dinosaurs, 8 gallimimus, 2 parasaurolophus, and 1 teenage tyrannosaurus, Pon-Pon. So-Yun found him in the forest, a cub, abandoned, with a festering wound on his side. She nursed him back to health for 3 months. She gave him Ari's herbal decoctions to drink. She fed him by hand. She slept next to him in the pen. Pon-Pon grew up, not to the size of an adult Tyrannosaurus, only half that size. But that was enough. He pulled a cart loaded with a metric ton of cargo across a mountain pass, slowly, with great effort, but he pulled it. And when So-Yun told him to stop in her language of hums and clicks, he would sit back on his and waited. A Tyrannosaurus in a team, the largest courier in the history of any world. The first winter after the unification with Krog turned out to be exactly what Jun Ho had been planning for half a year. A celebration, simultaneous, at all stations, in every cave, in every home in the network. Couriers delivered baskets, all identical, hot bread they'd learned to bake on flat stones, a piece of cheese, smoked meat, a small pot of honey. Each basket had a wooden tag with the recipient's name, burned onto it personally by Jun Ho. 500 tags. He burned them for 3 nights, every name, every person. He remembered them all. The woman from the northern tribe who was afraid of thunderstorms. The old man from the Gorak tribe who loved salted fish. The boy from the fisherman's tribe who wanted to become a courier. The girl from the Viroka tribe who drew flowers on stones. Every name, every face, a courier's memory, a professional quirk, the best quirk of his life. That evening, in 17 caves and 4 stations, 500 people opened their baskets, and in every basket lay a tag with their name, theirs, personally. And each of them knew that 2 days' journey away, or 5, or 10, another person would open the same kind of basket, with the same tag, with the same bread, and that a road lay between them, along which a cart would travel tomorrow, or a gallimime would run, or Pon-Pon would trudge, and bring something they needed. Tari, the old shaman. She received her basket, she took the tag, she looked at her name burned into the wood, for a long time. Then she looked at Jun Ho, who was standing by the fire and handing out the last baskets. She didn't say a word. In the morning, she came to the station kitchen and silently began to help. The 3rd year passed, and the 4th. Jun Ho no longer rode on his own.
He coordinated, he taught, he calculated, he drew maps, he made plans. His team worked without him. Teo became the network's chief engineer. He built stations, he repaired carts, he came up with new designs. His latest invention was a bicycle, a real one, with pedals, with a chain made of bone links. Clunky, creaky, but it worked. Theo rode it 10 kilometers in an hour and returned with a smile so wide it didn't fit on his face. Nay managed all the operations at Central Station. She fed everyone, dressed them, kept an eye on things. Her hands no longer ached. Her back was straight. She laughed every day, quietly, calmly, like someone who had finally stopped fearing tomorrow. Ari handled all the network's documentation. Her pictograms became the standard. Every courier knew the basic symbols. Every station had a stone logbook. Hannah handled diplomacy, quietly, skillfully, without wars. Kesson and Krog guarded the routes. Yeso led the mobile squad of express couriers on Gallimimes. She wore a yellow cloak with the same pride that Jun Ho had seen in the best employees of his old agency. Min-ji sat next to him every evening, and they drank tea from clay cups and spoke in Korean, about rice, about the monsoons, about Seoul, which she had never seen, and about Joseon, which he knew only from textbooks. They laughed. Sometimes they were silent.
Sometimes they just sat and listened as, beyond the station walls, a world full of teeth and claws roared. A world that was slightly less terrifying than yesterday. Soyeon was 13. She'd grown from a silent shadow into a quiet, strong girl who commanded dinosaurs with a single glance. Ponpon had grown to the size of a small house and pulled 2-metric-ton carts across the pass as if they were empty boxes. When Soyeon approached him, he would lower his enormous head, and she would place her palm on his nose. There was so much trust between her small hand and his table-sized snout that Jun Ho would freeze every time he watched them. This world could be cruel, but it could also be like this. One evening in his 5th year, Jun Ho sat on a rock in front of Central Station. The sun was setting. The valley was filling with golden light. A cart was traveling along the road he had built with his own hands. The cart carried sacks of salt, bundles of cloth, and pots of honey. A pictogram was painted on the side of the cart, a little man on 2 wheels, the network's logo, which Ari had designed. Modeled after the logo on his jacket. A courier in a yellow cape was steering a Parasaurolophus and humming softly. Somewhere on the Ponpon Pass, he was pulling a cart loaded with hot bread bound for the northern stations. Somewhere in the east, Yeso was racing on a Galamim with an urgent shipment of medicinal herbs. Somewhere in the south, Hana was signing a treaty with a new tribe, pressing her palm against wet clay. The network was alive. It was breathing. It was moving. Without him. Theo was sitting nearby. He was 17, tall, strong, with the hands of an engineer and the eyes of an inventor. He was sketching something new on a stone, some kind of structure with blades that was supposed to turn with the flow of water. A water wheel. Jun Ho hadn't shown him how to do it. Theo had figured it out on his own. On the other side sat May. She was mending a cloak and talking quietly with Min-ji. They had become friends. 2 women from different worlds and different eras, one from the Stone Age, the other from the Joseon dynasty. Both had found their place. Both were at peace. Both were home. Jun Ho looked at his hands, calluses upon calluses, scars from rocks and ropes, nails chipped and rough. The hands of a courier who had delivered cakes on a scooter for 3 years. Now these hands had built roads, smokehouses, carts, stations, a whole world, not just one, with everyone. He looked at his watch. 2:07 p.m., forever. The time of his death at the intersection in Seoul. The time of his birth in the mud at the feet of a boy with a spear. He took off his watch. He looked at it. Then he turned to Theo and held it out. The boy. No, not a boy anymore.
A young man. He took the watch. He looked at the cracked screen, at the frozen hands. He looked at Jun Ho questioningly. Jun Ho spoke in the tribe's language, which he now knew better than Korean. It kept track of time, back where I came from. Here, time is different. Here, it doesn't stand still. Here, it moves. Theo slipped the watch onto his wrist. It was too big for him. He tightened the strap. He looked at 2:07 p.m. He smiled, that broad smile with which he had once offered the stranger in the dirty jacket his first bite of the sour fruit. And he returned to his drawing of the water wheel. The sun was touching the horizon. The truck with the logo had driven around the bend. The dust had settled. The road was empty and smooth. It was waiting for the next delivery. Jun Ho looked at that road, at the world he hadn't chosen but that had become his home, at the people he didn't know but who had become his family, at the Tyrannosaurus in the team of horses that was hauling hot bread somewhere beyond the pass, at the little man on 2 wheels drawn on the side of the cart. And he thought the thought he'd wanted to think since day one, from the moment he fell face first into the mud with a cake in his bag, from the moment the boy with the spear didn't stab him, from the moment the woman with tired eyes set a bowl of food in front of him. He thought, delivered.